She was hired as a temporary assistant, but her boss is a millionaire who can't avoid the passion he feels for her. But before we dive into the full story, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is. Now, subscribe to the channel, and let's get started. A drizzle fell over the bustling city as Isabel Larson, just 22 years old, clutched her worn purse and hurried across the glass-paneled lobby. She could almost feel the curious stares of employees glancing her way, some offering a flicker of sympathy, others a hint of judgment. Her breath quickened. Today was her first day as a temporary assistant at Lionheart Motors, a prestigious car-selling empire reputed for its fierce competition and eye-watering profits. And right at the top of the pyramid, holding all the power, stood Zachary King, the mysterious millionaire CEO known for his lavish lifestyle and unrivaled business acumen. She had never expected to end up here. 1 month earlier, Isabel was finishing her last college exams, worrying about paying rent and searching for any job that might fit her meager resume. Then, out of nowhere, a phone call. Lionheart Motors needed a temp to cover a sudden vacancy. The position was rumored to be short-term, the pay borderline minimal. But for Isabel, it meant survival, perhaps even a small foot in the door at a major corporation. She had leapt at the chance, never suspecting how her entire life would be shaken from the moment she stepped inside those mirrored walls. The front desk manager, Alicia, gave Isabel a brisk nod and directed her to the 18th floor. On the elevator ride up, Isabel's heart thumped like thunder in her ears. Rumors about the CEO swirled in her mind. Mr. King was said to be as cold as steel, but also dangerously charming, an expert in closing deals and a master at reading people. Some employees whispered about his outrageous demands, others about the heartbreaks left in his wake. Yet for all his stony demeanor, there was something undeniably alluring about a man who had built an automotive empire from scratch by his late 30s. When the elevator doors opened, Isabel was greeted by a swirl of activity. Phones rang, papers flew, and a polished woman with severe glasses beckoned Isabel forward. "I'm Ms. Pierce, Mr. King's chief of staff," the woman said in a clipped voice. "You'll assist me with schedules, calls, errands, whatever needs doing. Efficiency and professionalism are key. Understood?" Isabel nodded, feeling a tremor of nerves flutter in her stomach. All around her, glass partitions offered glimpses of modern offices. A certain tension hung in the air, as if everyone were bracing themselves for a sudden storm. "Yes, Miss Pierce. I'll do my best," Isabel answered, wishing her voice didn't tremble. They wove through a corridor that overlooked the car dealership's main show floor. Rows of sleek, high-end vehicles shimmered under bright lights. From vintage classics to cutting-edge electric models, each car seemed to represent another layer of Zachary King's unstoppable empire. Isabel paused, entranced, but Miss Pierce snapped her fingers. "We don't have time for sightseeing." As they neared Mr. King's office, Isabel's breath caught in her throat. It was different from the other spaces. Tinted floor-to-ceiling windows encased a minimalist interior, with a single mahogany desk at the center. A vibrant painting of a roaring lion hung behind it. Through the glass, Isabel glimpsed the CEO himself, tall, impeccably suited, pacing across the room with a phone to his ear. She couldn't see his expression, but the tension radiating from his posture was enough to suggest a high-stakes negotiation was in progress. Ms. Pierce tapped on the glass door, then pushed Isabel inside with surprising firmness. Zachary King turned, phone still pressed to his ear. He locked eyes with Isabel, his intense gaze a contrast to his otherwise stoic face. She felt a jolt, as though she had just stepped too close to a live wire. The CEO said a brusque goodbye to whoever was on the other end of the line and set the phone down. He spoke in a low, measured tone that somehow carried the weight of a command. "So, you're the new temporary assistant?" Isabel managed a polite smile. "Yes, Mr. King, Isabel Larson. It's an honor to be here. I promise to—" He held up his hand, silencing her. "Let's hope you're up to the task. Efficiency is everything here. We move fast, Too fast for most. If at any point you can't keep up, let Ms. Pierce know, and she'll finalize your severance." A million possible replies flashed through Isabel's mind, but all she could do was nod. Everything about Zachary King was quietly intimidating, from his angular features to the way he seemed to look straight through a person. Isabel wondered if the stories about his business ruthlessness were true. If it were, how long could she last in this environment? "Take these." He shoved a folder toward her. "They're manufacturer reports. Summarize the new sedan's performance metrics by this afternoon. Send them to my personal email, and a word of warning." He leaned closer. "Don't CC the entire staff on a private document. Some misstep like that nearly cost me a major contract. This place is no playground." Isabel gulped. "Understood, Mr. King. Thank you." He dismissed her with a curt nod. Ms. Pierce motioned for Isabel to follow her back into the hallway, her high heels echoing across the marble floor. "This is exactly what I meant," Ms. Pierce hissed. "He expects results quickly. No excuses. You have until 3 p.m. All Isabel could do was nod and hurry over to a small cubicle at the end of the corridor. The gray partition seemed a world away from the glamorous offices, but at least it offered a semblance of privacy. She opened the folder, scanning through pages of raw data about engine performance, consumer response, and sales predictions. The scope overwhelmed her. She had to produce a concise report. Within a few hours, she would do it. She had to. With trembling hands, Isabel powered on the old desktop computer, hoping it would keep up with the demands of her analysis. She typed quickly, organizing figures and bullet points. Outside her cubicle, the pace of the office was relentless. Secretaries fielding calls, managers discussing marketing strategies, finance teams analyzing quarterly projections. The hum of the building felt alive, both exciting and terrifying. Every so often, Isabel would sense movement from the corner of her eye, an intern sprinting by, or Ms. Pierce glaring in her direction, or Mr. King himself crossing the corridor in a swirl of crisp suits and quiet authority. She couldn't escape the feeling that she was being tested, that any slip might lead to the dreaded severance Ms. Pierce had threatened. Still, she pressed on, losing track of time as she immersed herself in data. By the time the clock on her monitor blinked 2:45 p.m., she had compiled a thorough summary, double-checking the numbers. She swiftly emailed the report to Mr. King's private address, heart pounding. Would it meet his standards? Or would he pick it apart to show her how unprepared she was? 10 minutes later, Ms. Pierce approached with a phone in hand. She pressed it to her ear, nodded, then extended it to Isabel. "He wants to speak with you." Isabel took the phone, her palms clammy. "Hello, Mr. King?" A brief silence on the other end, then a subdued sigh. "The analysis is concise, accurate, as far as I can tell. Could you come to my office?" Her heart hammered. "Yes, sir." She hung up, grabbing her notepad. Miss Pierce watched her with an unreadable expression. "Try not to stammer," she advised icily. "He hates that." When Isabel re-entered Mr. King's office, he was at his desk, leafing through her report with surprising attentiveness. The tinted windows behind him reflected the city skyline, and Isabel realized the day had slipped away, leaving a haze of distant headlights and neon signs. He didn't speak immediately, letting tension coil in the air. Finally, he turned the last page. "Where did you learn to interpret these metrics?" She swallowed. "I studied marketing and finance in college, sir. I did a couple of internships that—" "Stop." His dark gaze settled on her. "It's good, but you've made notes in the margin about engine recall rumors. Where did you get that?" Surprise flickered across her face. "From the online consumer forums, sir. People have started complaining about a possible defect, though it's not public yet. I thought it might be relevant." His expression tightened. "In the future, don't mention unconfirmed rumors unless you have solid data to back them up." He paused. "But I'm impressed you caught wind of it at all. Next time, cross-reference them with internal engineering reports before you put it in writing. Understood?" Isabel nodded, pulse thrumming. For a second his gaze softened, something unreadable flickering in his eyes. "You're thorough, Ms. Larson. That's unusual for a new hire." A faint blush crept into her cheeks. "Thank you, sir. I appreciate the chance to work here." He set aside her report, straightening his suit jacket. "Keep it up. You may prove more valuable than a mere temp. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have another meeting." Then, in a quieter tone, "Do yourself a favor. Avoid office gossip. This place devours innocence." With that, he gestured for her to leave. Isabel stepped back into the hallway, a swirl of gratitude and confusion swirling in her mind. Why had his voice dropped at the end? Was it a genuine concern or just a warning meant to keep her on her toes? As she moved toward her cubicle, Ms. Pierce caught her elbow. "He never praises new hires. Not unless—" She trailed off, scrutinizing Isabel. "Stay focused, Ms. Larson. The slightest misstep can cost you everything. Don't let compliments get to your head." Isabel offered a polite nod, but felt tension creeping into her shoulders. She clutched her notebook, determined to prove her worth. Yet beneath her professionalism stirred a strange excitement. Something about the way Mr. King had looked at her, something in his intensity, both intimidated and intrigued her. She couldn't deny a faint spark of curiosity about the empire he commanded, about the guarded secrets behind his dark eyes, about why, for that fleeting moment, he seemed almost protective. Little did Isabel know that this spark would soon grow into a flame impossible to extinguish, drawing her into a world of corporate power games, private vendettas, and a complicated magnetic pull between boss and assistant that neither of them would be able to resist. By the time Isabel stepped into Lionheart Motors the next morning, her nerves had calmed only slightly. Overnight, she'd replayed her encounter with Zachary King in her head. His penetrating gaze, the subtle hesitation in his voice, the way he'd almost softened when acknowledging her work. She told herself it was just the relief of having finished her first assignment. Yet a fleeting thought nudged her. Was there something more behind his brief moment of warmth? She shook off the idea. Wishful thinking had no place here. Her plan was simple: keep her head down, prove her competence, and earn enough money to stabilize her life. Temporary or not, this job was an opportunity too big to squander. Still, the rest of the office didn't share her optimism. Lionheart Motors was buzzing with whispers about corporate changes, rumors of expansions, and multi-million-dollar contracts at stake. Isabel heard bits of hush-hush conversations as she walked the corridor. Something about a foreign investor with unpredictable demands, a line of new electric SUVs that had run into production setbacks, and a looming quarterly presentation that would make or break some careers. Even Ms. Pierce, normally stoic, looked unusually tense as she shuffled a stack of fresh reports. Before Isabel could settle at her cubicle, Ms. Pierce beckoned her over with a clipped motion. "Mr. King wants you in the conference room at 9 sharp, she said. "Don't be late." A flurry of questions flashed through Isabel's mind. Why would the CEO want a new temp at a high-level meeting? But Ms. Pierce had already spun away, phone in hand, snapping instructions at someone else. Isabel glanced at her watch. 8:56. She hurried down the hall, nearly losing one of her low-heeled shoes on the polished floor. She found the conference room perched on the building's top floor, its glass walls offering a dizzying view of the city skyline. Inside, a handful of executives already occupied sleek leather chairs around a marble table. They turned at Isabel's entrance, curiosity flickering in their expressions. The hush that greeted her was heavy, neither welcoming nor unkind, just deeply analytical. She recognized them from the employee portal, heads of marketing, finance, international relations, and at the far end of the table, Zachary King sat, leaning back in his chair, arms folded. Her heart jolted. His presence was almost magnetic, though his face was stone. She tried to look unfazed, returning a polite smile to the group. Then she stepped to the side, unsure where a mere assistant should stand. A tall, silver-haired man in an impeccable suit cleared his throat. "Good morning, Ms. Larson, I presume?" "Yes," she breathed. relieved he'd addressed her first. She recognized him as Jared Norris, Chief Financial Officer. Thank you for having me." Zachary King's voice cut in from the end. "You're here to take notes and prepare an immediate summary. This meeting covers sensitive negotiations for our upcoming partnership with Elysian Auto. There's no margin for error." Isabel nodded, quickly sliding into the lone, empty seat at the corner. She fumbled for a pen. Elysian Auto? She'd read about them. An international group rumored to be eyeing a massive joint venture with Lionheart Motors. She expected only high-level executives to be involved. So why was she here? The meeting began, and she discovered precisely why. Information flew around the table at a breathtaking pace. Talk of supply chain constraints, marketing strategies, foreign regulations, plus a swirl of acronyms she barely recognized. Yet each time Isabel felt overwhelmed, she forced herself to concentrate harder, scribbling notes, capturing key bullet points, summarizing the leaps in conversation. It was like an obstacle course for her mind, exhausting yet strangely exhilarating. 40 minutes in, the CFO gestured at the overhead screen. "Our largest vulnerability is the negative consumer buzz about engine reliability. The Elysian Group has flagged it, and they're worried it'll overshadow the SUV launch. They want proof we've addressed every concern." A muscle jumped in Zachary King's jaw. "We've tested those engines. The defect rates are well below industry norms. The real problem is the rumor mill. So let's gather social media analytics, real data from owners to show actual performance, not speculation. I want a brief by tomorrow." He directed that last phrase to the room at large, but his gaze flicked, just for a second, in Isabel's direction. She understood instantly. He wanted her to handle the research. A nervous thrill sped through her stomach. Could she do it by tomorrow? She resolved to figure it out, no matter how long she had to stay in the office tonight. Others spoke up about staffing changes and budget allocations. The conversation turned to brand reputation and how carefully Elysian would be monitoring even the smallest slip. Isabel kept typing, determined to show Mr. King that she was more than a wide-eyed assistant. She had insights to offer. She just needed the chance. Only once did she glance at him directly, and he caught her. Their eyes locked briefly, and a flicker of intensity pulsed through Isabel. She dropped her gaze, heat creeping to her cheeks. An hour later, the group dispersed. Several executives lingered to discuss final details with Mr. King while Isabel stood, notes clutched to her chest. She debated staying put. Was that appropriate? Then she felt a light touch on her elbow. Turning, she faced Mr. King himself, his expression carefully unreadable. "Do you have a moment?" he asked in a quiet tone that the others likely couldn't hear. She swallowed. "Yes, of course. Follow me." Without waiting for a response, he stepped out of the conference room. Isabel nodded politely at Ms. Pierce, who just pursed her lips as though unimpressed. They walked side by side down a corridor flanked by glass windows overlooking the entire sales floor. Through the glass, Isabel watched employees move among rows of gleaming vehicles, some answering questions for potential customers, others meticulously polishing car hoods. The hum of commerce rose faintly even here. Zachary King spoke abruptly. "The rumor research, compile real-time consumer feedback, separate verifiable issues from fabricated claims, then cross-check it with engineering data. You'll need to liaison with our digital marketing manager and some folks in R&D. Ms. Pierce can get you the contact list." "Understood," Isabel managed, keeping her voice steady. "I'll start today." He glanced at her, and for the briefest moment something more vulnerable glinted in his eyes, like a man on the brink of confiding a deeper worry. But it vanished almost instantly. "Make sure it's accurate. Elysian's tolerance for nonsense is 0. If we blow this joint venture, we risk losing not just them but also the next wave of major investors." She tried to meet his level gaze. "I'll get it right, Mr. King." A pause. Then he murmured, "Good." He cleared his throat, turning away as though he'd realized he'd shown her too much. "Ms. Larson," he said, more formally now. "Despite your newness here, you've shown promise. Keep focusing on the work. Don't be distracted by anything else in this environment." He might as well have pinned a neon sign reading "office gossip" above their heads. She swallowed, feeling that subtle friction again. On one hand, he warned her to keep her eyes on the job. On the other, there was a curious tension in his voice, as though something else tugged at him. Or, perhaps, she was imagining it all. "I won't be distracted," she said quietly. He gave a curt nod, then strode off, leaving Isabel at the edge of the corridor. She stared after him, mind spinning. Even though he maintained a formal distance, there was no denying the magnetism that seemed to crackle in the air. "You're being silly," she chided herself softly. Within minutes, she found Ms. Pierce. The older woman eyed Isabel as though suspecting some secret exchange. "You needed the contact list for R&D?" Ms. Pierce asked, her tone all business. "Yes, Mr. King wants me to gather data for a consumer feedback report. I'll likely need help from marketing, too." Ms. Pierce typed briskly on her tablet, then forwarded files to Isabel's computer. "That's everything. Remember, the CFO needs these numbers by tomorrow morning if he's to refine the pitch to Elysian by noon." Isabel's pulse kicked up. So little time. But she forced a composed nod. "I'll make it happen." The rest of the day blurred into a frenzy of phone calls, frantic note-taking, and sifting through digital archives of consumer reviews. She discovered small pockets of legitimate concerns about the SUV's battery life and occasional engine noise, but nothing matching the rumored catastrophic failures. By early evening, she was chasing down an engineer who happened to be finishing up a test in the basement facility. The engineer, a kind-faced woman named Priya, confirmed that official internal data showed far fewer issues than the rumor mill suggested. "People magnify small glitches," Priya sighed, handing Isabel another thick file. "They assume the worst. You can see here, 8 out of 1,000 have battery complaints, and even fewer with mechanical trouble. But negativity travels fast on social media." Isabel's shoulders drooped with relief. "That's great news. This can counter the negative press, show Elysian that the problems aren't widespread." Priya smiled. "You're new, right? Word around the engineering department is that Mr. King rarely trusts a junior staffer with tasks of this magnitude. You must have done something right." The comment sent a flutter through Isabel's heart. All day she'd half-doubted whether she was stepping out of line. Maybe Mr. King had given her this chore to test her until she cracked, but hearing Priya's observation shifted her perspective. Maybe he trusted her. Just a little. Armed with the data, she raced back upstairs and spent hours weaving the numbers into a cohesive report. By 9 at night, the majority of the building was empty. Only the hum of distant vacuum cleaners and the occasional echo of footsteps reminded her she wasn't entirely alone. She pressed on, ignoring her growling stomach, determined to finish. Finally, nearing midnight, she compiled the last line of text. She double-checked the entire presentation, then saved it. With a tremor of exhaustion, she emailed a copy to Ms. Pierce, copying the CFO. She hovered over the line for Mr. King's private email, hesitating only a moment. He'd expect to see it. So she CC'd him too, using the format he had demanded. No wide distribution, no accidental staff blasts. Just the bare minimum. She exhaled deeply, shutting down the computer. Her reflection in the dark screen showed a mix of relief and fierce determination. She'd survived 2 intense days, and though the weight on her shoulders was enormous, a spark of quiet pride glowed inside her. Maybe she really did belong here. Outside, the city lights twinkled, and Isabel caught a glimpse of her own reflection in the glass as she paused by the windows. So much had happened in such a short time, and the tension with Zachary King, she tried to label it as professional tension, but something inside argued otherwise. She shook the thought away again and made for the elevator. As she stepped into the silent lobby, a subtle wave of triumph washed over her. All that mattered was getting through tomorrow, giving the CFO his data, and proving once more that she wasn't just a naive newbie. She was capable. She was prepared. If only that sense of confidence could quell the swirl of emotions she felt whenever the elusive CEO crossed her path. Isabel woke the next morning to a sharp alarm, her eyes gritty from only a few hours of sleep. She snatched her phone from the nightstand, half expecting a deluge of messages about the consumer feedback report she'd emailed so late last night. But there were none. A tiny knot of anxiety coiled in her stomach. Did that mean everything was fine? Or had her message gone unnoticed? She hurriedly got dressed, pulling her hair into a neat ponytail. After grabbing a quick coffee from a corner cafe, she stepped onto the sidewalk leading to Lionheart Motors, dwarfed by the skyscraper's imposing facade. The tinted windows and sleek architecture reminded her how powerful the company was, and how easily it could cast aside an assistant who didn't meet expectations. She inhaled, squared her shoulders, and walked in. Up on the 18th floor, Ms. Pierce was already sorting papers into immaculate piles. "There you are," the older woman said brusquely, handing Isabel a glossy ID badge. "Temporary or not, you'll need this for certain restricted areas. Today's going to be hectic. Mr. Norris, the CFO, wants that data in a presentable format by 10. Have you updated anything from last night?" Isabel felt a surge of relief that someone had at least acknowledged her work. "Yes, ma'am. I finalized everything around midnight." "Good. Then get it prepped. Print copies for the Elysian reps. They'll be in the main conference room by noon. Oh, and Mr. King wants to see you as soon as you're done." A flicker of nervous excitement danced in Isabel's chest. "Right. I'll finish quickly." She headed to her little cubicle, flicked on the computer, and began formatting the slides. She was nearly done when a new email popped up in her inbox from Zachary King's address. "Impressive work. Come see me when you have a moment." Her heart hammered. Underneath the curt phrasing, she sensed praise, maybe even a thin attempt at encouragement. She read it twice, a faint smile tugging her lips. Impressive work. If she concentrated on that piece of it, maybe it would steady her jitters when she stepped into his office. She finished up, printed the packets, and gathered them in a tidy stack. Then, with a deep breath, she made her way down the corridor to the executive suite. Outside his door she paused, smoothing her blouse. Ms. Pierce had warned her more than once that Zachary King had no patience for hesitation. So Isabel knocked firmly. "Enter," came his low voice. He was standing by the window, gazing out at the city below, one hand in his pocket. Tall and poised, his figure caught in the morning light looked almost cinematic. When he turned, his expression was somewhere between contemplative and guarded. "Good morning, Mr. King," Isabel said, struggling to keep her tone even. "Ms. Larson." He gestured for her to take a seat. "I read your consumer feedback report. It was thorough, more thorough than I asked for." There was the faintest note of approval in his tone. "I see you cross-referenced engineering data and appended real-time social media sentiment charts. That kind of initiative is not common here." Heat rose to her cheeks. She straightened a little. "Thank you. I just wanted to make sure Elysian sees we're prepared to counter any negative perceptions." He inclined his head. "The CFO was pleased as well. He's incorporating your findings into the presentation." Her chest swelled with quiet pride. But then Zachary King's gaze sharpened, revealing a flicker of tension. "In a few hours the Elysian reps will arrive. They're known for dissecting every angle of a prospective partnership. We need to be ready for questions, even unspoken ones. That means paying attention, Ms. Larson. Watch for anything that might rattle them or us. We can't afford slip-ups." It took Isabel a moment to realize he was, in a way, inviting her behind the scenes, expecting her to join the meeting not just as a note-taker, but as an observer with a strategic eye. "I understand," she said. "I'll keep track of their concerns, their reactions." He nodded curtly. "Exactly. If you notice any detail, any sign of hesitation, any shift in their tone, bring it to me privately. This partnership could reshape our company's future, so everyone will be on edge." His voice was measured, but Isabel caught a glimpse of deeper stakes. Maybe the swirl of rumors was true, that Lionheart's expansion hinged on Elysian's capital and distribution network. If so, it explained why Zachary King was pushing himself, and everyone else, to the brink. A brief silence fell. She shifted, about to stand, but he cleared his throat. "Also, about last night. You worked very late, didn't you?" "Until midnight," she confessed, fiddling with the corner of her notebook. "I wanted to ensure the data was complete." "Don't make it a habit," he said, his gaze flicking across her face. "I understand dedication, but there's a limit to what I expect from my staff, especially a temporary assistant." There was something almost gentle in his tone, as if a hint of concern broke through. Isabel's heart gave a tiny flutter. "I appreciate that, Mr. King, but I'm willing to do what it takes." He nodded, then turned away, as though he'd caught himself showing too much. "That's all for now. Be in the main conference room 15 minutes before noon. Ms. Pierce will coordinate the materials, and Ms. Larson, good work." The gentle dismissal was overshadowed by those two words, good work, and the fleeting softness in his eyes. She stood, thanked him, and left, her mind whirling with half-formed questions. Had he been worried she was overworking herself? That seemed at odds with his reputation for being unyielding, yet there it was, a small crack in the CEO's armor, hinting at something more human beneath. She had no time to dwell on it. Within the hour, the entire office was abuzz. The CFO's team roamed the hallways with anxious expressions, adjusting last-minute slides, triple-checking financial projections. Ms. Pierce came by Isabel's desk and thrust a folder into her hands. "These are the final confidentiality agreements for the Elysian Group. Make sure each rep receives one. Get their signatures before the meeting starts. Understood?" Isabel nodded, scanning the legal verbiage. "Understood. I'll handle it." Downstairs, the marketing department was reviewing brand proposals for Elysian's premium line, while the legal department scurried about verifying compliance documents. Everywhere Isabel looked, people wore the tension of high-stakes negotiations like a second skin. She wondered if she was the only one quivering inside with a different kind of excitement, one that sprang not just from the thrill of important work, but from the memory of Zachary King's faint smile. When noon approached, she hurried to the main conference room. The place had been transformed. Crisp bottled waters lined the table, a projector displayed the Lionheart Motors logo against a sleek black background, and plush chairs were arranged to face the head seat, where Mr. King would likely preside. The CFO hovered near the screen, fussing with a remote control, while Ms. Pierce directed two assistants who were setting out brochures. Then the Elysian representatives arrived, flanked by a small entourage. Isabel was ready with the confidentiality forms. She distributed them to each person, 3 well-dressed executives with polished accents and discerning eyes. She noticed how they scanned the documents, no nonsense in their expressions. This was a team used to dissecting every contractual nuance. A tall man with silver temples introduced himself as Henry Koenig, Elysian's chief negotiator, and offered Isabel a polite nod as he signed. "Quite a robust setup," he remarked, glancing around. "Lionheart is serious about this partnership." "Yes, sir," Isabel answered, calm. "We've been preparing for weeks. I hope you find everything in order." She noticed a brief flicker of curiosity in his gaze. Perhaps he wasn't used to seeing such a young assistant fielding documents with confidence. Or maybe he just hadn't expected Lionheart's staff to be so prompt. Either way, she offered a polite smile. Mr. King and the CFO entered together, wearing identical expressions of professional calm. The room quickly settled as they took their seats. Isabel slipped into a chair off to the side, her laptop open for note-taking, prepared to track every question, every hesitation. The CFO led off the meeting, Summarizing the proposed joint venture, he covered manufacturing integration, distribution strategies, and the synergy between both brands. Next, a marketing vice president chimed in about the consumer market. Then, Mr. King spoke, his voice quiet but firm, painting a vision of what the combined enterprise could achieve. Isabel felt a tingle of admiration. He had a way of making even the most intricate financial plans sound vital and exciting. Meanwhile, the Elysian reps asked razor-sharp questions. How do you plan to mitigate production risks? What's your contingency for supply chain disruptions? We've heard whispers about mechanical flaws. How are you addressing them? Right on cue, Isabel forwarded the relevant data to the large screen, highlighting her consumer feedback analysis. She explained the raw figures quickly, but let Mr. King and the CFO handle the deeper financial angles. It was exhilarating to see the synergy. Mr. King's strategic calm blended with her behind-the-scenes data. After her quick run-through, she sensed the Elysian team's stance shift, slightly more open, slightly more trusting. But Koenig wasn't done. He leaned back, steepling his fingers. All well and good, but brand reputation can shift on a dime. We've learned to watch not just the official numbers, but the undercurrents as well. Are you certain you've confronted every rumor, even the far-fetched ones? A frisson of tension laced the air. Isabel glanced at Mr. King, who signaled her with a slight tilt of his head. She understood. It was her cue to clarify further. Rising from her chair, she inhaled. Mr. Koenig, we've run sentiment analyses across all major social platforms, including niche car owner forums. We've identified about a dozen threads pushing negative rumors, some about engine noise, a few about battery performance. Our engineering data shows only a fraction of real cases. We've proactively addressed consumer concerns via direct outreach, offering free diagnostics to anyone who reported such issues. The result? Most threads died down within days. So far, none of these rumors have escalated into a recall situation. Koenig assessed her, intrigued. The room hushed around them. Then he inclined his head, lips curving slightly. That's quite thorough, Ms. Larson. Thank you. Before she could sit, Mr. King chimed in. We have nothing to hide, Henry. If something arises, we tackle it head-on. That's the Lionheart way. Those words, delivered with unwavering confidence, seemed to echo in the silent conference room. Koenig exchanged a silent glance with his colleagues. Then he gave a firm nod. All right, let's proceed. The negotiations continued, shifting into more technical details. Isabel felt a rush of relief. They hadn't been stumped. The Elysian group was clearly still on board. Her chest thrummed with adrenaline. She took swift, comprehensive notes, focusing on the subtle signals in Elysian's body language. Occasionally, she caught Zachary King's gaze drifting her way, perhaps checking if she was capturing everything, or maybe verifying if she noticed any hidden tension on the Elysian side. With each passing minute, she realized how seamlessly they'd begun working in tandem, even in front of a room full of executives. It felt like a quiet partnership. He led the room with authority. She supplied precisely what he needed at the right moment. As much as she tried to keep it purely professional, a part of her couldn't ignore the sense of closeness, of mutual reliance. And as the session neared its end, Isabel became aware that she wasn't alone in noticing. A few Lionheart employees and even an Elysian rep or two glanced curiously between her and Zachary King, as if sensing the faint but undeniable energy in the air. Isabel kept her face neutral, scribbling away on her laptop. One thing was certain, no matter how well she navigated these negotiations, the intangible connection she felt toward Mr. King was growing more prominent each day. And with every look he gave her, brief, intense, and charged, she suspected he felt it too. That afternoon, the entire Lionheart team exhaled in collective relief as the Elysian representatives departed in a discreet caravan of black cars. The negotiations had gone well. No final signatures yet, but the mood was optimistic. Handshakes were exchanged, and Koenig even offered Zachary King a wry smile as he promised to review the numbers with his board. The moment the doors to the elevator slid shut behind the Elysian group, applause broke out in the main lobby. A few employees from marketing and finance clapped each other on the back. The CFO allowed himself a pleased grin, and Mr. King, though outwardly composed, seemed lighter somehow, as if an invisible weight had briefly lifted from his shoulders. Isabel stood near the front desk, scanning her notes one last time to be sure everything was documented. She felt the fatigue of a long day, but also a satisfaction that sparked across her senses. Every piece of data she'd compiled, every presentation slide had played a part in shaping the conversation. She'd held her own in front of top executives, and, judging by the outcome, she hadn't disappointed. "Nice work," came Ms. Pierce's curt voice behind her. She glanced around, all tight-lipped efficiency, yet her stern features softened the tiniest fraction. "I mean that sincerely. You kept everything organized, on cue. Mr. King took notice." Isabel's cheeks warmed. "Thank you. I'm just relieved we impressed Elysian enough to keep them at the table." Ms. Pierce gave a sniff that might have been agreement. "We're not out of the woods, but yes, you did well. Now, a heads up. There's an informal post-meeting debrief in Mr. King's office. Only the key staff will be present. He specifically asked that you come." Instantly, Isabel's heart did a small flip. "He did?" "Yes," Ms. Pierce said flatly. "Let's go. They're waiting." The corridor leading to Zachary King's office hummed with energy. Inside, a small group had already gathered. The CFO, 2 of the senior VPs, and a couple of finance managers. Mr. King stood by his desk, arms crossed, wearing a faint half-smile that made him look both victorious and guarded. When Isabel entered, his gaze met hers momentarily, long enough to leave her pulse racing. "All right," the CFO began, waving a folder. Koenig seemed positively inclined. "Questions remain, but nothing that looks insurmountable. If we handle the formalities right, we could have a draft contract within a month." "Agreed," Mr. King said, "though Elysian will no doubt push for an aggressive profit share. Keep that in mind for the next round of talks." Then his attention shifted to Isabel. "Ms. Larson, you were in the thick of it. Any impressions about their body language, tone, anything that might have gone unsaid?" She blinked, momentarily flustered by the direct attention. "Well," she inhaled, organizing her thoughts. "They're cautious, but not closed off. When we discussed the battery rumors, Mr. Koenig seemed relieved we had real data. The only moment of true hesitation I noticed was when they asked about our supply chain's stability. I'd guess they'll want more reassurances on that in the coming weeks." Mr. King's mouth curved into a subtle smile, as though this was precisely the feedback he'd hoped for. "Good. CFO, let's prepare detailed reports on supply chain risk management. I'll also have Ms. Larson polish an executive summary. We'll deliver it to Elysian's team ASAP." Isabel's breath caught. Another big assignment, this time front and center in front of Lionheart's top brass. The CFO gave her a friendly nod, apparently comfortable with the idea. The moment almost felt surreal. 2 days ago, she was worried about making a good impression. Now she stood among the senior circle, briefing them. "Also," Mr. King continued, "I'd like to recognize everyone who helped ensure these negotiations went smoothly. A lot of late nights, a lot of new hires stepping up." His gaze flickered in Isabel's direction. "We'll keep the momentum and remain vigilant for the next phase." The meeting wrapped up with a round of quiet kudos. As the small group began to filter out, Ms. Pierce and the CFO leading the way, Isabel lingered, gathering some leftover documents into neat piles. She overheard the CFO joking about whether the next round of negotiations would happen over a fancy dinner. Ms. Pierce simply scoffed that there was too much work for any of that nonsense. Everyone seemed buoyant, proud of themselves for surviving the big day. Zachary King stayed behind as well, finishing a phone call in hushed tones. He hung up, then approached Isabel, who was double-checking file folders. She felt him draw near before he spoke, the energy between them strangely heightened. "You did well, Ms. Larson," he said softly, just loud enough for her to hear. "Your intuition regarding their concerns was spot on." She tried to keep her tone even. "Thank you, I'm just grateful for the chance to be involved." His gaze lingered on her face, and she realized how close they stood, an arm's length, maybe less. She could see the faint lines of exhaustion around his eyes, the tension that never fully left his posture. Yet there was something about him in that moment, an undercurrent that pulled her in. Maybe it was the adrenaline of the successful meeting or the flush of being singled out. Either way, she felt that now familiar swirl of awareness. "I rely on staff who can adapt quickly," he continued. "Lionheart moves at a relentless pace. Not many can handle it." A slight trembling sensation spread through Isabel's limbs, though she kept her voice steady. "It's been challenging, but I'm doing my best." Zachary King's gaze flicked to where his team was stepping into the hallway, their voices drifting away. Then he dropped his tone further so that only she could hear. "I hope you'll let me know if it becomes too much. I have a tendency to demand a lot." Her pulse thudded. He was so close. Close enough that she caught the faint scent of his cologne, a subtle mix of bergamot and something woodsy. "I will," she managed. A tension-laced beat passed, charged with something unspoken. Then he seemed to recollect himself, straightening. His professional mask slid back into place. "All right, Ms. Larson," he said lightly, voice returning to a normal volume. "Send me that executive summary as soon as you have a draft. For now, go get some rest." She nodded, pivoting toward the door, heart hammering. Stepping into the corridor, she found Ms. Pierce waiting with a pointed look. Isabel wondered if Ms. Pierce had overheard or spotted something. But the older woman only said, "Come on, you look about ready to pass out. Let's wrap up and call it a day." Back at her small studio apartment that evening, Isabel stretched out on the couch, mind whirling with the day's events. She tried to read a novel, tried to watch a comedy show on her laptop, but her attention kept snapping back to images of the conference table, the swirl of executives, Mr. King's fleeting glance. Even recalling it made her chest tighten in a confusing mix of exhilaration and worry. She knew it would be beyond reckless to entertain personal feelings for her boss, her powerful, wealthy, older boss, who'd only hired her as a temp. Nothing good could come of it, right? Her rational side insisted as much. And yet, there was no denying the spark, the way her heart fluttered when he praised her, or the way he seemed to look past her professional facade and acknowledge her as someone essential. Pushing a hand through her hair, Isabel groaned softly, wishing she could shut off the swirl in her head. She reminded herself of the precariousness of her situation. One misstep, and she was out. The chaos of her finances, the father who refused to help her, the roommate arrangement that had just ended. She had no safety net. Becoming entangled in a personal drama with a man like Zachary King could cost her everything. "But you don't even know if he sees you that way," she told herself. "Maybe he was just being decent. Maybe the tension was in your imagination." Sighing, she decided to distract herself with the executive summary. If she drafted an outline tonight, tomorrow morning would be less hectic. She opened her laptop at the wobbly kitchen table and began typing bullet points about supply chains, distribution, and the next steps for Elysian. With each line, she forced her mind back into the safe realm of facts and figures, distance from the swirl of her personal thoughts. Sometime after midnight, she dozed off over her notes. She dreamt of polished floors and glass-walled offices, of a lion roaring in the background. And somewhere in that dream, a quiet voice whispered her name, low and urgent and compelling. Morning arrived with a slap of sunlight through the window. Isabel jolted awake, stiff from sleeping, hunched over her table. She scrambled up, quickly checking the time. The clock on her phone read 7:46. Not terrible. She still had time to shower and head in. She quickly pressed a cup of coffee, gulped it down, and dashed out. When she arrived at Lionheart Motors, the atmosphere felt celebratory. A few employees exchanged satisfied smiles, discussing the internal memo from the CFO praising the negotiation team. Isabel tried to share in the excitement, but a note of tension threaded her mood. She still had so much to prove, especially if she wanted a permanent role, if that was even an option. She posted herself at her cubicle, scanning emails. Within minutes, Ms. Pierce was at her shoulder. "Mr. King wants your summary by 10 a.m., she said briskly. "He'll hold another strategy meeting. Elysian hasn't confirmed anything new yet, but we have to stay ahead." "I'm almost done," Isabel replied, tapping her keyboard. "I'll email it soon." Ms. Pierce nodded, then hesitated. "Look, I'm not your enemy, Ms. Larson. I've been with Mr. King a long time. You're talented. Just be mindful that ambition can be a double-edged sword around here." Isabel paused, reading between the lines. Perhaps Ms. Pierce sensed the growing closeness, or worried Isabel would fall into some rookie trap. "I appreciate the advice," she said softly. A slight purse of Ms. Pierce's lips, then she walked away. Isabel sighed. She knew the older woman meant well, or at least wasn't trying to sabotage her, but the warning settled heavily on her. Did Ms. Pierce suspect something about the unspoken tension swirling between Isabel and Mr. King? She refused to dwell on it. Instead, she buckled down, finishing the executive summary with bulletproof clarity. By 9:45, she'd completed it. She proofread it twice, hitting send. Her phone pinged almost instantly with a reply, just a short note from Zachary King. "Got it. See me at 10:30. She felt that same little jolt in her core. The sense that inch by inch she was edging deeper into his orbit. And behind the professional facade, she couldn't ignore the flicker of anticipation. After printing a few reference copies, Isabel headed toward the CEO's office right at 10:30. What waited for her this time? More tasks, more praise, more moments of disconcerting closeness? Steeling her nerves, she knocked on the door. "Come in," came his voice. Her fingertips tingled as she turned the knob. However complicated, however potentially dangerous this unspoken connection might be, she couldn't help stepping forward, drawn by the need to see where it would lead and what it might cost her in the end. Isabel stepped into Zachary King's office at exactly 10:30, her heart pounding a steady rhythm that she hoped was silent to everyone but herself. The blinds had been partially drawn, allowing thin beams of morning light to slice across the polished floor. He was seated behind his mahogany desk, studying something on his computer screen. When she entered, he glanced up, and that electric undercurrent filled the room again, quiet but unmistakable. "Come in," he said, gesturing to the chair across from him. She approached, carefully placing the executive summary folder on the desk before taking a seat. The smell of coffee from a nearby cup mingled with the faint leather aroma of the furniture. "I've read your summary," Mr. King began in his usual measured tone. He tapped a finger on the folder. "It's thorough and direct. Precisely what we need to show Elysian how we'll navigate supply chain risks." Isabel exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "I'm glad it meets your expectations." He didn't respond right away, as though weighing his next words. Then he leaned back in his chair, the overhead light catching the faint lines of fatigue at his temples. "We'll send it to Koenig's team this afternoon. Ms. Pierce is already clearing the distribution with our legal department, so you can finalize the formatting. But there's something else I want to discuss." Her pulse jumped. She clasped her hands in her lap to still them. "Yes, sir?" He opened another folder on his desk, a set of glossy documents she recognized from the marketing department. They were early proposals for a Lionheart Elysian co-branded electric SUV line full of mock-ups and brand synergy plans. "We're in the process of building a specialized marketing team for this potential joint venture. It will include data analysts, brand strategists, and 1 or 2 junior positions for research and coordination." She sensed an undercurrent in his words, something that made her heart skip. That sounds like a big project. It is. And if all goes well, that team will be instrumental in ensuring a smooth launch, bridging Lionheart's legacy with Elysian's reach. He paused, looking her in the eye. You've shown you can handle high-level research, short deadlines, adaptability. In short, the qualities I want in that team. Isabel's eyes widened. For a moment, she forgot to breathe. Was he implying she might shift from being a temp assistant into a more permanent role? She forced herself to sound calm. I appreciate that vote of confidence, Mr. King. He nodded, but kept his tone businesslike. We're not finalizing roles yet, especially since the partnership isn't signed. But I'm letting you know you're on my short list, if you're interested. Her mind spun with excitement. This was precisely what she'd dreamed of. A chance not just to do admin tasks, but to shape real strategies, to build a stepping stone for her career. Of course I'm interested, she said softly, then caught herself. Clearing her throat, she added, I'd be honored to be considered. His stern features relaxed a fraction, enough for her to notice. Good. We'll discuss details later. For now, keep doing what you're doing, and if Koenig's team calls with further questions, help Ms. Pierce compile anything they need. I will, she promised. He closed the marketing folder, but his gaze lingered on her as though something remained unsaid. She waited, heart thudding. At last, he drew a quiet breath. I realize you've only been here a short time, Ms. Larson. Lionheart's environment can be intense. If at any point you feel overwhelmed... She braced for the rest of his statement, aware once again of the gentle hint of concern behind his words, the subtle crack in the otherwise impenetrable CEO. But the door opened behind her, and Ms. Pierce stepped in, iPad in hand. Immediately, the dynamic shifted. Zachary King's expression cooled, and he straightened in his chair as though re-armoring himself. Pardon the interruption, Ms. Pierce said, voice brisk. But the CFO's on the line. He wants to go over final numbers for next quarter's operating budget. Also, we got word Koenig might request a conference call before day's end. King gave a short nod, standing. Thank you, Ms. Pierce. Then, to Isabel, you can finalize the summary distribution. If they call, you'll join me. Isabel gathered her things, trying to stifle the disappointment at being cut short. That small personal moment, so rare, had vanished like a puff of smoke. Still, she managed a polite, "Yes, sir," and slipped out, Ms. Pierce right behind her. In the hallway, Ms. Pierce exhaled, scanning her tablet. We'll need the summary in PDF form, locked for editing. Make sure you highlight the sections on supply chain redundancies. Legal wants disclaimers at the bottom. I'll forward the instructions. Isabel nodded, forcing her mind back to work. Consider it done. The day churned on with relentless speed. Isabel dove into final edits, juggling phone calls and scanning new data from the engineering team. She had lunch at her desk, a quick salad eaten in hurried bites between emails. Occasionally, she'd catch sight of Mr. King passing in the corridor, usually with Ms. Pierce or the CFO, always deep in urgent conversation. Her phone buzzed around mid-afternoon. She picked up, half expecting to hear Koenig's clipped accent. Instead, it was Ms. Pierce. Come to the 18th floor lounge, Ms. Larson. Mr. King's leading an impromptu strategy session, and your data might be needed. Isabel saved her files, then rushed to the lounge, a glass-walled area set up with comfortable chairs and a panoramic view of the city. She found a small group already gathered, marketing leads, a couple of managers, and Zachary King himself. A hush settled over them as she approached. Ms. Larson? Perfect timing, the CFO said, waving her over. We're discussing whether to approach Elysian with a preliminary brand synergy campaign now or wait until after the contract is signed. Mr. King stood by the windows, arms crossed, silent for the moment. It was the CFO who explained the dilemma. Revealing too much marketing strategy early might come off as presumptuous, but waiting might suggest a lack of preparation. "What do you think?" the CFO asked Isabel suddenly. She blinked. "Me?" The CFO nodded. "Yes, you've worked closely on consumer perception. Do we show Elysian we're confident about a future collaboration, or do we hold back?" Her heart pounded at being put on the spot in front of these high-level executives. She glanced at Mr. King. His gaze on her was steady, almost encouraging, though he said nothing. Taking a breath, she began carefully. "I'd suggest a balanced approach. We can share a snippet of our brand synergy ideas, not the entire plan, just enough to demonstrate readiness. That way, Elysian sees we've put real thought into it, but we also maintain control of the conversation. If we wait until everything's signed, we risk Elysian thinking we lack vision, but if we flood them with a full campaign, they might think we're overstepping." A beat of silence followed. Then the CFO nodded slowly. "That makes sense. A teaser, show we're prepared but not arrogant." A marketing lead agreed, "Yes, that's actually a clever tactic. We can produce a small teaser doc. Something polished, but not final." As the conversation continued, Isabel noticed Mr. King's faint smile, as though satisfied she'd steered the debate in a fruitful direction. He seemed to store the moment away, letting his team elaborate on the idea while occasionally giving short nods of approval. Within 10 minutes, they had a plan. Marketing would whip up an abbreviated synergy deck, to be shared only if Koenig or his colleagues pushed the conversation in that direction. The group broke up, each member hurrying off to tackle tasks. Isabel gathered her notes, aware that Mr. King was watching her from the corner of his eye. She carefully placed her pen in her bag and was about to leave when he spoke quietly. "Ms. Larson." She turned. The CFO had already stepped away, leaving them briefly alone in the lounge. Through the glass, she saw employees passing by, but no one seemed focused on them. "That was a good call," he said. "I like the middle ground approach." She felt a flutter of pride. "I'm glad. The last thing we want is to look passive or overeager." His lips twitched in approval. "Indeed." For a second he studied her face as though searching for something. Then he seemed to remember where they stood. "You should finalize those notes. We'll share them with the marketing director before the day ends." He started to turn away, and Isabel realized she didn't want him to go, at least not without bridging the gap that had formed since Ms. Pierce interrupted them that morning. Summoning courage, she spoke softly, "Mr. King, earlier you mentioned the specialized team. If Elysian signs, do you really think I have a chance at a permanent position?" He paused, glancing over his shoulder. His expression was measured, but behind that professional exterior, she glimpsed a flicker of warmth. "I meant every word, Ms. Larson. If you want it, and you keep performing at this level, I don't see why not." Her heart soared, but she kept her smile contained. "Then I'll do everything I can to exceed expectations." His voice dropped an octave, so only she could hear. "You already are." Then, as if snapping back to the present, he nodded curtly. "Carry on," he said in his normal tone, walking away toward the exit. She was left standing there, the cityscape behind her, a swirl of fresh possibilities in her mind. A few weeks ago, she'd been a desperate college grad, scraping for rent money, uncertain if she belonged in such a high-powered environment. Now she was advising top management, finding ways to impress Elysian, and edging toward a potential permanent role. It felt both exhilarating and precarious, like dancing on the edge of a cliff, glimpsing amazing views, but knowing one wrong step could tumble her into disaster. Hugging her notes to her chest, she left the lounge. Once back at her desk, she typed up the strategy session's outcome, sending it to the relevant managers. The hours flew by. Emails arrived from Koenig's junior staff asking for clarifications, and she responded in crisp, polite language. More than once, she glanced toward the hallway leading to Zachary King's office, quietly aware of how each success tied her closer to him, tethered her deeper to this world of ambition and magnetism. As evening approached, Ms. Pierce gave her a nod of approval. It was the closest thing to a smile Isabel had ever seen on that woman's face. "We're in good shape for the moment," Ms. Pierce said. "Go home. Rest. Tomorrow we'll be just as busy." Isabel packed up, feeling drained but satisfied, stepping out into the cool night air a little after 8 p.m. Traffic buzzed along the streets, neon headlights reflecting off tall glass buildings. She spotted her own reflection in a nearby window, hair slightly messy from a long day, but with a determined set to her jaw. On her way to the bus stop, she let herself imagine what might happen if the partnership was signed and she joined that specialized team for good. She saw a future of challenging tasks, late-night strategy sessions, and possibly traveling to Elysian's overseas facilities. She imagined forging a real career at Lionheart, but at the same time, she knew it meant working even closer with Zachary King, walking that narrow line between professional respect and the subtle, undeniable tension that lingered each time they stood too close. As the bus pulled up, she felt the corners of her mouth lift in a small, private smile. The path ahead might be daunting, but it was hers to take. And no matter how treacherous it could become, she couldn't deny that she'd already taken the first steps. Caught up in the orbit of a powerful man and an empire on the brink of a major deal. Perhaps it was foolish to tread this path, to feel that flutter whenever he looked her way. But as she settled onto the bus seat and gazed at the blurred city lights, she couldn't convince herself to pull back. Something in her whispered that she was meant to see this through, whatever destiny might have in store. The next morning felt oddly still, as though the entire office held its breath, waiting for Elysian's next move. Isabel arrived earlier than usual, armed with a strong cup of coffee and a renewed sense of determination. She wanted to use the quiet hour before official start time to tie up any loose ends, recheck a few figures, finalize documents, and maybe slip in a quick brainstorming session for the upcoming brand synergy teaser. She settled at her cubicle, opened her laptop, and set about reviewing her email inbox. A few standard overnight messages glowed at her from various departments. Then a more recent note popped up with a subject line reading, "Confidential. Preliminary queries from Elysian." Her pulse kicked a little faster as she clicked it open. The email, forwarded by Ms. Pierce, contained a succinct list of clarifications from Koenig's junior team. Precise questions on shipment timelines, minor engineering specs, and marketing budgets. Isabel's eyes scanned the bullet points, heart thumping. If Elysian was sending deeper queries, it meant they were still actively engaged, possibly a good sign. She was busy drafting replies when she felt a presence at her side. Startled, she turned to see Ms. Pierce standing there, face impassive but eyes alert. "Morning," Ms. Pierce said quietly, nodding at the screen. "I see you're already on it. Koenig's people have been emailing since dawn. Mr. King wants the answers compiled and ready for discussion at 10. Isabel nodded, straightening in her seat. "I'll have a draft response by 9. Should I forward them to the CFO as well?" "Absolutely. He'll want to confirm the financial angles. Also loop in the engineering lead for those spec details." Ms. Pierce paused, scanning the area as though verifying no one else was listening. "There's a rumor going around that Elysian might skip a second round of negotiations and jump straight to drafting a memorandum of understanding if these clarifications go smoothly." Isabel's heart fluttered. A memorandum of understanding could be a huge step, practically the final stretch before official contracts. "That's really exciting," she said, careful not to sound too eager. "Yes, exciting and dangerous." Ms. Pierce eyed her. "We'll have to be vigilant. Any slip now, any sign of disorganization, and Elysian may demand harsher terms. Or walk away altogether." "I understand," Isabel murmured, shifting her gaze back to the queries on her screen. She felt a renewed push of adrenaline. If Koenig was testing them, she had to ensure every answer was watertight. "Good," Ms. Pierce concluded, handing over a stack of papers. "This is the latest data from finance. Cross-check these figures before sending your draft." I'll keep an eye on your progress." With that, she pivoted on her heel and strode away, leaving Isabel to her tasks. She spent the next hour methodically weaving the new finance data into a clear, confident reply. For the engineering portion, she pinged Priya downstairs, her contact from earlier, and quickly confirmed that nothing had changed with the battery specs. That done, she appended disclaimers from the legal team regarding shipping timelines. By 8:55, she had a polished draft. She reread it twice, checking for typos or vague wording, then finally attached it to an internal email labeled "For Review, Elysian Clarifications." She copied Ms. Pierce, the CFO, the engineering lead, and Zachary King. Almost instantly, Ms. Pierce responded with a thumbs-up emoji, unusual from someone so formal. Isabel couldn't help a small grin. Progress indeed. At 10 o'clock on the dot, she found herself in a glass-walled conference room with half a dozen others, including the CFO, Ms. Pierce, and 2 marketing directors. The meeting started with the CFO praising the clarity of Isabel's draft response, then pivoting to possible pitfalls if Elysian pressed them further. Zachary King arrived a few minutes in, stepping silently through the door. Although the conversation continued, Isabel felt a low buzz in her consciousness whenever he was near, an awareness that prickled at the edges of her thoughts. He took a seat at the head of the table, flipping through the printed copy of her draft. "Let's walk through each point," he said calmly, leaning forward. "We need to be absolutely certain none of these specs are outdated or overpromised. Finance, you're sure the cost margins won't fluctuate within the next quarter?" One of the finance managers cleared his throat. "Yes, sir. We locked the supply contracts for at least 6 months. If Elysian wants an extended timeline, we may need to renegotiate, but for now, the margins stand." "Engineering?" King asked next, turning his dark eyes on Priya, who had joined them. Priya smiled and nodded. "We're ahead of schedule on battery testing. No major changes. The latest feedback from QC indicates a less than 2% defect rate, well below standard thresholds. We've included the official numbers in Ms. Larson's draft response." King's gaze flicked across the table to Isabel. A faint, approving glint appeared in his expression as he spoke. "So we can finalize and send by midday?" The CFO nodded. "Yes. The only debate is whether to add a footnote about potential expansions to a second manufacturing facility if demand exceeds projections." Isabel's instincts nudged her. She cleared her throat softly. "If we mention that second facility, Elysian might ask for a detailed timeline we don't fully have yet. Perhaps we should keep that as a discussion point for a later stage, so we don't appear unprepared." Mr. King studied her. "Good insight. We'll omit the mention for now." He paused, scanning the group and concluding in that smooth, firm tone, "All right, Ms. Larson, finalize the letter. CFO, sign off on it. Let's aim to send the response to Koenig by 1 p.m. Meeting adjourned." Chairs scraped as everyone stood, gathering documents. Isabel tucked her notes under her arm, mind already jumping to the next steps. But as the small crowd began to disperse, she felt a gentle nudge on her elbow. She turned to see Mr. King standing close, voice subdued amid the shuffle. "Can you step into my office before you finalize everything?" he asked. "There's one more detail I'd like to discuss." A little shiver of anticipation ran through her. "Of course." She followed him, letting the CFO and the others drift away down the corridor. As she entered the CEO's office, large windows, warm sunlight, the faint hush of thick carpeting, she braced herself. However routine the request might be, she knew every conversation with Zachary King carried an undercurrent, and she felt it humming even louder now, especially when he shut the door behind them, cutting out the noise of the hallway. He stepped behind his desk, laying a few papers down. Then he turned to face her, his features unreadable. "I wanted to mention something off the record," he began. The slightest hesitation colored his words. Isabel's heart tripped. "Sure." He exhaled, leaning one hand on the desk. "I've noticed how often you end up working extra hours, staying late, coming in early, skipping breaks." His gaze flicked over her, and there was a hint of concern there. "This environment is intense. I don't want you burning out." She swallowed, touched by his thoughtfulness. "I appreciate that, Mr. King. But truthfully, I'm just doing what needs to be done. It hasn't felt like too much, not yet." He studied her expression. "Well, if you find yourself struggling, come to me or Ms. Pierce. The pace here, especially with Elysian's demands, can swallow people whole. Believe me, I've seen it happen." She nodded, her throat tight. "I will, sir. Thank you." A small silence spread between them. Through the window, a faint view of the city glimmered, but inside, the air seemed thicker. She watched his posture, saw how his shoulders carried tension despite the success of the negotiations, and she realized that behind all this talk of caution might lie his own guilt. Maybe he'd pushed employees to breaking points before. He cleared his throat, easing back from that vulnerable note. "Anyway, another reason I asked you in here is that Koenig's email references wanting to see an updated organizational chart for the proposed joint venture. I'd like you to draft that chart, just the preliminary version. Include your name under project coordination, along with a placeholder for another junior researcher." Her breath caught. It was a direct statement that she was indeed on track for a bigger role in the near future. "Of course," she managed softly. "I'll have that by tomorrow." He gave a curt nod, but then before she could turn away, he said more quietly, "You're valuable, Ms. Larson. To Lionheart." Her heart gave a little stutter. "Thank you," she murmured. Their eyes locked, and for a second the swirl of attraction roared to life beneath her professional veneer. She was certain he felt it too. His gaze flicked to her lips so quickly she almost missed it. In another world, maybe she would have lingered, let that tension spark a confession. But reality pressed down. He was her boss, powerful and guarded, and they were locked in a high-stakes corporate race. So she simply broke the moment with a small smile and said, "I'll finalize the letter for Koenig now." He inclined his head in acknowledgement, stepping back behind his desk as though redrawing a boundary. "Yes, good." Isabel left the office, a warmth pulsing through her chest. She tried to bury it in her tasks, immediately sitting at her desk to incorporate the final changes. She typed swiftly, ignoring the slight tremble in her hands. The tension she felt with him was exhilarating, terrifying, and undeniably real. Sometime after noon, Ms. Pierce sent a message asking if the letter was ready. Isabel replied with an attached final version, then rose to fetch a quick sandwich in the break area. She needed a moment to breathe, to clear her head. As she stood by the vending machine, unwrapping her lunch, she caught snippets of conversation from two marketing employees chatting nearby. "Wonder how close we really are to sealing the deal," one said. "Heard Koenig's almost convinced, but the rest of Elysian's board might push back," replied the other. "But from what I see, Ms. Larson's been doing a bang-up job. Surprised she's a temp." Isabel froze. They'd said it casually, with no malice, just mild curiosity. It reminded her how visible she'd become, stepping from anonymity into the spotlight of these negotiations. Not everyone would watch her with friendly eyes. Some might question her meteoric rise, might suspect nepotism, or worse. She tried to shrug it off, finishing her sandwich. She would handle that bridge if she ever came to it. After lunch, she returned to her desk to find a new email from Koenig's assistant, acknowledging receipt of the clarifications. The tone was friendly, even borderline enthusiastic. She exhaled a long breath of relief. So far, so good. At 4 o'clock, Ms. Pierce scheduled a quick debrief with Isabel to discuss next steps. They met in a small side office, Ms. Pierce perched stiffly on a rolling chair, Isabel with her tablet. Together, they hashed out new deadlines and assigned tasks for the next wave of marketing materials. At the end of the short meeting, Ms. Pierce paused, looking at Isabel with that hawk-like precision. "You're juggling an awful lot, Ms. Larson," she said. "I remember what it's like to be new, hungry for growth. But I'd hate to see you misjudge your limits." Isabel forced a calm smile. "I'll be careful, and if it's too much, I'll speak up." Ms. Pierce nodded, almost grudgingly. "See that you do." A brief silence. Then she added, "You've impressed him, you know, Mr. King." Isabel tried to keep her composure. "He's been appreciative of my work, yes." "Just stay grounded," Ms. Pierce murmured. "Lionheart is full of brilliant people who came and went in a flash because they forgot to keep their feet on the floor." Understanding the subtext, Isabel replied quietly, "I won't forget." They parted ways. Isabel felt her chest tighten. Ms. Pierce's warnings, though cloaked in formality, conveyed a deeper caution. Don't get carried away by ambition or possibly by feelings. The older woman had no proof of personal entanglement, but perhaps she sensed the intangible magnetism swirling around her boss and this young assistant. By the time 6 p.m. rolled around, Isabel had polished a draft of the new organizational chart. She slipped it into a folder, planning to show Ms. Pierce or Mr. King tomorrow. With the day winding down, she decided to pack her things and head home. But as she stood to leave, her phone rang, Mr. King's extension. Steadying herself, she answered. "Isabel Larson." His voice, low and subdued, filled her ear. "Ms. Larson, Koenig just scheduled a video call for 9 tomorrow morning. I'd like you in my office to field any data-related questions. Send me the updated org chart as well. Tonight, if possible. I want to review it at home." Her breath caught. He'd be looking at her work late, presumably from his private residence. "Understood. I'll email you in the next hour." A pause on the line. Then, almost gently, "Thank you, Isabel." And the call ended before she could respond. She stared at the phone for a moment, that strange swirl of warmth and tension flooding back. Though he'd used her first name, she guessed it was unintentional. Maybe just a slip at the end of a long day. But it felt personal, a quiet acknowledgement that they were forming some deeper connection in the midst of corporate chaos. She sank into her chair, saving the final PDF of the org chart. After a thorough check, she attached it in an email titled, "For Your Review." With a resolute click, she hit send. Exiting the building half an hour later, she let the evening air cool her heated thoughts. Somewhere out there, Zachary King would open that file from the comfort of his modern penthouse, scanning her ideas in solitude. And tomorrow, they'd face Koenig again, side by side, this time on a video call. Another step in a high-stakes dance that was inching them closer and closer, both to the biggest deal of their careers and to a line they probably shouldn't cross. As she made her way down the sidewalk, a hum of anticipation pulsed through her. She clutched her bag a little tighter. One thing was certain. This was no mere office job. She'd entered the lion's den of ambition and intrigue, where shadows of possibility loomed at every turn, and though reason whispered she should tread carefully, her heart pounded with the thrill of taking that next bold step. Isabel arrived at Lionheart Motors the next day with her chest tight and her mind buzzing. She had slept fitfully, thinking about the video call scheduled for 9 o'clock. By 8:45, she had already settled at her desk, reviewing every document she might possibly need. Sales forecasts, engineering milestones, marketing briefs. If Koenig's team asked a question, she intended to have the answer at her fingertips. Just before 9, Ms. Pierce briskly approached. "Mr. King wants you in his office now," she said, tapping her watch for emphasis. "They'll be connecting the call any minute." Isabel shot to her feet, gathering her folders. "On my way." Inside Zachary King's office, the lights were dimmed, the blinds partially closed to reduce glare. A large wall-mounted screen was already active, showing a waiting screen for the video conference system. Mr. King stood behind his desk, tapping an icon on a tablet. He nodded at Isabel when she entered, his expression focused and cool. We'll have audio and video through here, he said, indicating the screen. You can sit next to me and handle any detailed queries. A ripple of self-consciousness moved through her at the suggestion, sitting side by side, close enough to share a screen. She forced that feeling aside, knowing the professional stakes were far more urgent than any flicker of nerves. Understood, she murmured. He gestured at a chair set near his. She settled in, placing her folders on a small side table. The instant she did, the screen flickered and a trio of faces appeared. Koenig and two other Elysian executives, all poised in what looked like a sleek conference room with the Elysian logo on the wall behind them. "Morning, Mr. King," Koenig said briskly. "We appreciate you making the time. We have a handful of points to clarify after reviewing your latest response." "Of course," Zachary King replied, leaning forward. "We're at your disposal." Koenig nodded, then launched into a tight rundown of topics. They asked about timeline contingencies, the proposed organizational chart, and the staffing plan for the joint venture. Isabel swiftly brought up her notes when Koenig zeroed in on how many junior analysts Lionheart planned to dedicate to the project. "We're aiming for 2 to 3 full-time," Isabel explained, her voice steady despite the undertone of adrenaline. "Initially, we see this team handling data processing, consumer sentiment analyses, and coordination with marketing." Koenig's colleague, a woman named Delphine, raised a brow. 2 to 3 might be acceptable at first, but if the project scales, will you expand that team?" Isabel flicked her gaze to Zachary King, who nodded for her to continue. "Yes. Mr. King and the CFO have already discussed scaling the team as needed. If our launch targets grow, we have budget placeholders ready, should Elysian decide to accelerate." She sensed, rather than saw, Mr. King's faint smile of satisfaction at her precise wording. Delphine seemed impressed. "Glad to hear it." The conversation continued. Mr. King handled the broader strategic points while Isabel jumped in for specifics. Koenig and his team probed deeper than ever, clearly testing for any weak spots. An hour passed, then nearly 2. At last, Koenig checked his watch. "Well, this has been productive," he said. "One final question. Are you willing to demonstrate any marketing teasers before formalizing an agreement? We're getting pressure from our side to see a hint of how Lionheart imagines the branding rollout." This was the moment Isabel had rehearsed. She tapped a file on her tablet, sending it to the screen share. "We've prepared a brief concept outline," she said, projecting a series of sleek minimalist slides. They showed a handful of combined brand visuals, a couple of sample slogans, and a mock-up of an electric SUV brochure with both logos tastefully integrated. As the slides flicked by, Koenig and Delphine exchanged looks that might have been approval. Isabel quietly exhaled, hoping it was enough to pique their interest without seeming pushy. When the final slide faded, Koenig nodded. "Interesting approach, clean, modern, and not heavy-handed. I like it. We only have the bare bones at this stage," Isabel clarified, "but we're ready to expand if you give the word." "Understood." Koenig leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. "Let's plan a follow-up in-person meeting to dive deeper, possibly next week. Would that be feasible?" Mr. King glanced at Isabel. "We'll check schedules, but yes, that should be fine. We'll coordinate with Ms. Larson to confirm details." "Perfect," Koenig said. "Then we'll let you go for now. We're nearing the point where our board will expect a memorandum draft. Let's keep communication flowing." A chorus of goodbyes and thanks filled the call, and then the screen went dark. Isabel let out a long breath, feeling the tension settle from her shoulders. She turned to look at Mr. King, who was powering down the screen. "They seemed optimistic," she ventured. He nodded, voice low with satisfaction. "They did. I suspect a memorandum is coming soon. The CFO will be thrilled." Then his eyes flicked to her. "You did well." She smiled in relief. "I'm glad." The office door opened and Ms. Pierce slipped in, scanning the room with typical briskness. "That sounded encouraging," she commented. Should I schedule a debrief with the CFO? Mr. King nodded. Yes, this afternoon. In the meantime, see if you can narrow down dates for next week's in-person meeting. He paused, then added, and Ms. Larson should join, of course. Ms. Pierce gave Isabel a quick glance. Naturally. She slipped out again, leaving them alone. Isabel gathered her folders, heart still racing from the high-pressure call. I'll finalize the summary of today's discussion and send it around, she said. Thank you, Mr. King murmured. He took a seat behind his desk, shifting a pile of files. Yet she noticed a subtle hesitation in his movements, as if he wasn't quite done talking. Finally, he glanced up. Listen, with the next meeting likely happening in person, I want you fully integrated with the negotiations. You'll be there, not just taking notes, but contributing input as we finalize the Memorandum of Understanding. A surge of excitement. Of course, I'll do everything I can to prepare. He observed her, and for a fleeting second, the weight of his gaze hit her, like he was seeing not just an assistant, but an ally, a partner in this project, and perhaps something else. The tension that always lingered between them stirred, making the air feel charged. But Ms. Pierce's voice echoed from the hallway, calling another question about the CFO's availability, snapping him out of the moment. Go on, he told Isabel briskly, returning to his more formal demeanor. We have a busy day. She rose, hugging her notes to her chest and left. But the sense of shared momentum followed her like a hush around her heart. By mid-afternoon, the CFO held a debrief in the primary conference room. Isabel sat near the end of the table, meticulously recording action items. As the CFO recounted the positive tone of Koenig's final remarks, the atmosphere crackled with optimism. They discussed possible contract outlines, how to handle any last-minute Elysian demands, and which staff to include in the final negotiations. When the CFO suggested bringing in an external consultant for risk analysis, Ms. Pierce turned to Isabel. You've been compiling data from multiple departments. Do you think we have enough internal resources, or should we really hire an outsider? Isabel considered carefully. We probably have enough data in-house. Our only gap might be legal nuance if the contract includes certain performance clauses, but for general risk analysis, we're covered. The CFO nodded thoughtfully. In that case, we'll skip the consultant, at least for now. Meeting concluded, everyone filed out with subdued excitement. As Isabel tidied up her notes, she overheard two finance managers chatting near the door. This Larson girl, she's come out of nowhere, one remarked, shaking her head in mild astonishment. I see her everywhere, handling tasks like she's been here for years. The other manager shrugged. King must see something in her. Isabel's cheeks burned. She pretended not to notice, but the comments reverberated. Yes, she'd made a name for herself quickly, but the sudden attention could stir resentment. She reminded herself to be careful. Office politics could be as treacherous as any other battlefield. She left the conference room and headed toward the break area for a glass of water. Her head hummed with everything that needed doing, and her shoulders felt stiff. Maybe Ms. Pierce was right. She had to find a moment to breathe. Tucking her notes under one arm, she turned a corner and nearly bumped into someone. A tall figure caught her elbow to steady her. You all right? Asked a friendly, familiar voice. It was Priya, the engineer who'd helped her before. Priya, yes, I'm fine, Isabel said, stepping back with an apologetic grin. Sorry, lost in my thoughts. Priya laughed softly. No worries. We're all a bit on edge with this Elysian business. Heard the call went well today? Very well. We're pushing toward the next step. Isabel sighed, letting the day's tension show for a moment. This place is intense. I can imagine. You're everywhere lately. CFO meetings, marketing briefings, the CEO's office. Priya teased gently. When do you breathe? Isabel managed a sheepish smile. Some days I forget. They moved aside to let a group of interns pass. Then Isabel added quietly, but it's good, really. I'm learning so much. Priya nodded knowingly. Just be sure to look after yourself. King's a demanding boss. If you ever need an ear or a coffee break, track me down." Touched by the kindness, Isabel thanked her, then continued on her way. She retrieved her water, letting the cool liquid soothe her frazzled nerves. With some willpower, she refocused on the to-do list. Finalize notes, check if Ms. Pierce got an update from Elysian's scheduling department, and skim any last-minute memos that might have popped up. Late in the evening, she was still at it. The office had cleared out substantially. Lights dimmed in some corridors. Feeling a tightness in her neck, she stretched and glanced at the clock. 7:45. Realizing she'd skipped dinner, she rummaged in her bag for the granola bar she kept as a backup snack. She had just taken a bite when her phone buzzed with a text message, unusual because few people texted her rather than emailing. She frowned, setting aside her granola bar to see Ms. Pierce's name on the screen. "Pierce, Mr. King is asking for you in the executive lounge. Not urgent, but he wants to discuss next week's meeting schedule. He's still here." Isabel's stomach twisted with that familiar mix of excitement and nerves. She typed a quick reply, "On my way," and stood, smoothing her pencil skirt. This wasn't the first time she'd been called to meet late, but it felt different somehow, more personal than just an email or phone call. She walked through the half-lit hallway to the executive lounge, a quiet space with panoramic windows and a scattering of plush chairs. She found Zachary King there, standing by the glass, his silhouette outlined against the city's twinkling lights below. For a moment she paused at the threshold, struck by the image, the powerful CEO, alone in a silent skyscraper, shoulders heavy with the weight of an empire. He turned as she entered and flicked on a small table lamp, creating a warm glow that chased away the gloom. "Ms. Larson," he greeted, the corners of his mouth lifting in a faint semblance of a smile. "Thanks for coming up." She stepped closer, conscious of how intimate the setting felt without the usual daytime bustle. "Ms. Pierce said you wanted to review next week's schedule?" "Yes." He motioned toward a low table where a manila folder lay. "Koenig sent an outline of dates they're considering for the face-to-face. I want your input on which sessions to prioritize." She nodded, dropping into a nearby chair. He sat across from her, elbows on his knees, posture relaxed in a way she rarely saw. It made her heart pound. They began sifting through proposed agendas, marketing synergy on Monday, supply chain on Tuesday, final contract negotiations by Thursday. As they talked, Isabel couldn't help noticing small details about him, the faint shadow of stubble that suggested a long day without a break, the subtle crinkle at the corner of his eye when he read something surprising. He was different at night like this, less guarded. Her thoughts drifted from the schedule to the complexity of the man behind it. "So Monday would be a half-day of brand discussion," she said, scanning the sheet. "They want to see physical prototypes of the SUV. We'll need engineering on site." He nodded. "Agreed. Priya can handle the Q&A." A pause, then, "And you'll lead the consumer sentiment piece. They seem to trust your data more than any consultants." She felt a tremor of pride. "Happy to do that." A silence settled. She looked up to find him watching her, a quiet intensity in his gaze. Time seemed to stretch, no flickering phones or chatty co-workers to break the tension. Her heartbeat thudded as she realized how close they were, how much it felt like they were alone in an entirely different world than the usual corporate hustle. "All these late nights," he said softly. "I worry you might be overwhelmed." She shook her head, searching for composure. "It's a lot, but I'm managing. I want to be here." His eyes never left hers. "Is that right?" She swallowed, words tangling in her throat. "Yes, you've given me opportunities I never expected. I'm grateful." He exhaled, glancing down at the folder on the table. "I push people, Ms. Larson. Sometimes too hard. It's not always out of choice. It's what this company requires. But I realize it can come at a cost." She hesitated, an unfamiliar urge to close the distance, to reassure him welled up inside her, but she kept her hands in her lap, voice gentle. "You've been pushing yourself too." He let out a low, rueful laugh. "For years. It's hard to shut it off." Something in the warmth of his tone, the slight vulnerability, set her pulse racing. She weighed 1,000 potential replies, uncertain what line she risked crossing. Should she keep it all professional? Could she deny the tension that had simmered for days? Before she could speak, he looked at her again, and his voice lowered. "You know, I've never had a temp assistant quite like you." Her breath caught. "In a good way, I hope," she managed with a fragile attempt at humor. He let out a faint chuckle, genuine but subdued. "Yes, in a good way." The unspoken meaning between them hummed, a current neither was fully acknowledging. He shifted, leaning just a fraction closer, and her mind tumbled with the possibility of what might happen next. Was he about to confess something, or was she misreading? But a soft chime from his phone on the side table shattered the moment. He sighed, grabbed it, and read a message. Tension leaked from his posture as he stood. "It's the CFO. Says there's an urgent numbers discrepancy in next quarter's forecast." Even as disappointment flickered through her, Isabel forced a smile. Never a dull moment. He returned her smile, albeit with a trace of regret. "That's Lionheart for you. Let's pick this up tomorrow. Get some rest, Ms. Larson." He snatched the folder, heading out of the lounge without looking back, the spell broken. Isabel stayed behind for a moment, heart pounding in her ears. Gradually she rose, rubbing her temples. The swirl of attraction, concern, and corporate ambition was a recipe for something potent, either a burst of success or a catastrophe waiting to unravel. She left the lounge, riding the nearly empty elevator down to the lobby. Outside, the city streets glistened under street lamps. She pulled her coat tight, her thoughts returning to the way he'd looked at her, the weight behind his words. Maybe they were both rushing down a path that would blur the lines between professional and personal. But she couldn't deny the thrill that lingered in her chest. No matter how dangerous it felt, she was in it now, every thread of her life woven a bit tighter around Zachary King and Lionheart Motors. And as she hailed a cab, she couldn't quite wipe the soft, almost hopeful smile from her face. The rest of the week whipped by in a flurry of urgent emails and frantic coordination for Elysian's upcoming visit. Isabel found herself juggling endless tasks, drafting updated consumer reports, compiling legal disclaimers for the proposed Memorandum of Understanding, and working closely with Priya's engineering team to prepare physical demos of the electric SUV. Each evening she left the Lionheart building well after sunset, exhilarated and exhausted in equal measure. Throughout it all, the subtle pull between her and Zachary King never quite faded. Their conversations were professional, pointed, efficient, but beneath the surface, that quiet electricity persisted. A few times Ms. Pierce's sharp eyes flicked between them whenever they were in the same room. Isabel tried not to overthink it, focusing on the tasks at hand. Yet she couldn't entirely ignore the stray glances or the sense that something big simmered just below the calm facade. By Friday afternoon, Elysian's team confirmed they would arrive the following Tuesday. Isabel was at her desk, finalizing an in-depth briefing packet, when Ms. Pierce strode over briskly. "Ms. Larson," she said in her usual clipped tone, "we're calling a final planning meeting with the CFO and the marketing directors in 10 minutes. Mr. King wants you there, conference room C." Isabel glanced at the clock. It was already 3:50. She quickly saved her work and gathered the relevant files. "I'll be right down." When she reached conference room C, she saw that the CFO, Ms. Pierce, 2 marketing leads, and a legal advisor were already there. Zachary King arrived moments later, his expression set in that composed, thoughtful way she'd come to recognize. He slid into a chair at the head of the table and signaled for the meeting to start. "All right," the CFO began. "Elysian's arrival is locked in for Tuesday morning at 10. We have them until late Wednesday. We need to finalize the itinerary so they see everything from engineering to marketing. Then, presumably, we negotiate the memorandum on Thursday. The marketing director leaned forward, skimming a printed schedule. We propose dividing them into 2 groups for day 1. Koenig and the top execs can view the SUV prototype, while the others sit with us for brand synergy. Day 2, we regroup for contract clauses. Then, if all goes well, sign by midday Thursday. The legal advisor chimed in, caution in his voice. We should anticipate last-minute questions from their board. They might be testing our flexibility. Let's keep an alternative schedule on standby in case they want to shuffle sessions. Zachary King nodded, gaze flicking over the group. Agreed. Ms. Larson, you've compiled the departmental briefs. Any red flags we should be aware of before we lock in times? She took a breath, scanning her own notes. Engineering will need at least 2 hours for a full demonstration, plus Q&A. Priya's team says anything less will feel rushed. Marketing can handle a condensed 1-hour slot for synergy discussions if needed. Finance expects an entire afternoon to address cost structures, so maybe schedule finance last, giving Elysian time to see everything else first. That way, they'll have fewer unanswered questions going into the numbers. A round of nods ensued. The CFO made a note on his tablet. That's sensible. Let's do it. They spent the next half-hour structuring the day-by-day breakdown. Isabel jotted every detail, aware that Ms. Pierce was quietly assessing how she contributed. Meanwhile, Zachary King occasionally cut in with a decisive remark. No, Koenig will expect more detail than that, or we'll keep the brand synergy portion streamlined. Together they shaped a final itinerary that felt comprehensive and efficient. Once they'd hammered out the final plan, Zachary King stood. Excellent. Ms. Pierce will distribute the schedule by end of day. Ms. Larson, you'll handle any departmental concerns if they find conflicts. Let's meet Elysian's group prepared and polished. A wave of relief brushed the room. People sensed real momentum. The meeting adjourned. As usual, everyone filtered out, eager to complete the tasks on their own lists. Isabel lingered to gather her papers. She was methodically tucking them into a folder when Ms. Pierce touched her shoulder. Before we call it a day, Mr. King wants an internal run-through of Tuesday's main presentations, Ms. Pierce said. We'll do it at 5 in the main conference room, sort of a dress rehearsal. It's mandatory for the department heads. You'll probably need to be there. Isabel hid a weary smile. Of course, there was always one more thing. Sure, I'll be there. At exactly 5, Isabel made her way to the main conference room. She found a small crowd assembled. The CFO, 2 marketing directors, Priya from engineering, a couple of finance managers, and Ms. Pierce. Zachary King arrived last, striding in with his usual calm command, flipping through a sheaf of papers. All right, let's get started, the CFO said. We'll pretend tomorrow is Tuesday, 10 o'clock, and Elysian just arrived. Marketing, you go first. What followed was a rehearsal of each department's pitch. Marketing unveiled the brand synergy slides, practiced transitions, and answered hypothetical queries. Engineering showcased a short video of the SUV prototype in testing. Finance walked through cost breakdowns. Each segment ended with the CFO or Mr. King offering critiques. Shorten that portion, highlight this feature, move that chart to the end. Isabel, seated near Ms. Pierce, noted every tweak for final edits. When the marketing team finished, Ms. Pierce signaled Isabel. Ms. Larson, can you give us a condensed version of the consumer sentiment report? That's likely to come up early on day 1. Isabel felt a flutter of nerves, but stood. She'd rarely done a formal presentation in front of so many high-level employees, though she'd spoken in Q&A sessions. Clearing her throat, she pulled up her slides on the projector. Good evening, everyone. This is a summary of our latest consumer sentiment analysis, focusing on electric SUVs and potential brand overlap with Elysian. She spoke steadily, referencing data on brand loyalty, the mild negativity from rumor mongers, and the surge of positive interest once people saw actual performance stats. A minute in, she risked a glance at Zachary King. He observed her with the same intensity as always, his expression carefully neutral, but she sensed approval in the slight nods he gave her. Finishing, she turned off the projector. Any questions? A few clarifications from marketing were quickly addressed. Then the CFO gave a short applause. Clear and concise, he said. This is exactly how you'll handle it with Elysian. Zachary King didn't applaud, but a faint curve of satisfaction touched his lips. Well done, he said. We'll keep it that tight during the real presentation. Let Elysian ask for more if they want. No need to overwhelm them. Isabel felt warmth spread through her. Understood. Priya and engineering followed with their portion. After nearly 2 hours, the run-through concluded. Everyone looked tired but pleased. The CFO, after exchanging a few final remarks with Mr. King, called it a day. People dispersed with murmurs about going home to get some rest before the final push on Monday. Isabel packed her laptop, fully expecting to do the same. But as she stepped out into the corridor, Zachary King's voice caught her ear. Miss Larson, a moment? She turned, noticing how Ms. Pierce and Priya were heading in the opposite direction. The hall was nearly empty. Yes, sir? He gestured for her to walk with him. They moved quietly down the corridor to a smaller corner lounge that was rarely used. The overhead lights were dim, and in the muted glow, his dark suit cast long shadows across the tile floor. Isabel's heart rate edged up. Once more, they were alone in a quiet nook of this corporate maze. He stopped by a window that overlooked the city. The sky was dusky pink, streetlights blinking on in neat rows. He glanced at her, expression half lost in the low light. I just wanted to say that your presentation was exemplary, he began. You handle yourself well under scrutiny. She gave a slight shrug, fighting a smile. It helps to have prepared so thoroughly, and you set the standard. Everyone here knows you expect perfection. His lips curved in a near smile. I do, but not everyone can match it. You've proven to be an exception. The praise stirred a fresh flutter of emotion, part pride, part something more. She tried to quell it, reminding herself of Ms. Pierce's repeated warnings about boundaries. But the hush of the hallway, the softness in his tone, everything conspired against her better judgment. Thank you, she said quietly. I'm just doing my job. He studied her face. For a second, she feared he might say something too personal, something that would crack the delicate barrier they both maintained. Instead, he inhaled as though bracing himself. Tuesday, we'll be at the apex of these negotiations. With Elysian in the building, tensions will skyrocket. It won't be easy. I know, she said, voice steady. But I'm ready. He stepped a fraction closer, gaze intense. You may face questions about your credentials, your role. Some might see your rapid involvement as unusual. If any of Elysian's people imply you're inexperienced or unqualified, you stand firm. You've earned your place at this table. Her breath caught. It was a personal show of support she hadn't expected. I appreciate that. I won't let them intimidate me. Their eyes locked, the city lights casting reflections on the glass behind him. The corridor was silent aside from the distant hum of ventilation. She sensed again that magnetic tension, a current that almost drew her forward. For an instant she imagined leaning in, her pulse roaring in her ears. But then, from down the hallway, footsteps approached. Mr. King blinked, pulling back. An assistant from finance stepped into view, glancing at them briefly before scurrying past. Whatever moment had been building, it evaporated. Isabel swallowed, fighting the rush of conflicting emotions. Mr. King cleared his throat, resuming his cool composure. Anyway, we have Monday to finalize small details. Then it's showtime. She nodded, hugging her laptop. Right. I'll keep refining the data, just in case. He gave a curt nod. Yes. Good night, Ms. Larson. She murmured a quiet goodbye and walked away, footsteps echoing along the corridor. At the elevator, she glanced back once but saw only an empty hallway. He must have slipped into another office or returned to his. The tension in her chest refused to subside, heart thrumming with unvoiced possibilities. Riding the elevator down, she exhaled shakily. Tuesday loomed, and with it, the chance to either secure the biggest deal of Lionheart's recent history or watch it all collapse under pressure. For her own part, these past weeks had been an exhilarating, dizzying rush. She'd stepped far beyond any boundary she might have imagined for a temporary assistant, and as she stepped out into the city night, she knew the next few days would bring clarity. Clarity about her future at Lionheart, about whether Elysian would trust them enough to sign, and maybe, just maybe, about how far this growing spark with Zachary King could go before it set them both ablaze. Weekend sunlight streamed through Isabel's modest apartment on Saturday morning, bathing her tiny living room in warmth she barely had time to appreciate. Although it was officially her day off, she couldn't shake the weight of Tuesday's approaching negotiations. Outside, the city buzzed with weekend energy, couples strolling with coffee cups, friends chatting in line for brunch, the usual hum of cars and distant sirens. But for Isabel, the moment felt suspended. She had too much on her mind to fully enjoy a carefree Saturday. She perched on the edge of her couch, laptop balanced on her knees, scanning a newly arrived email from the CFO. He'd sent a last-minute request for additional brand comparisons, wanting some data on how other automotive partnerships had fared with electric vehicles. She sighed, taking a sip of her rapidly cooling tea. Even on a Saturday, there was no escape. Though a hint of annoyance stirred, did they not realize she needed rest too? She reminded herself how close they were to a career-defining triumph. With Elysian's in-person visit looming, the entire Lionheart team was on high alert. Accepting the reality, she began combing through industry reports, typing quick notes and cross-referencing sources. Her phone buzzed, interrupting her concentration. She half expected another email notification, but the screen displayed Priya's name. Relieved to see at least one friendly contact, Isabel answered. "Hey, Isabel," Priya greeted brightly. "I know we're all drowning in work for Tuesday, but I was planning to swing by the office in a couple hours to run some final checks on our prototype demonstration. Thought maybe you'd want to come, see if everything lines up with the marketing angle?" Isabel glanced at the mountain of documents on her laptop screen. Another afternoon in the office wasn't exactly appealing, but she knew this time could be essential for ensuring no embarrassing glitches in the SUV reveal. "That's probably wise. I can help confirm the details. Let me finish something here and I'll meet you there." "Perfect," Priya said. "I'll be in the engineering bay. We'll keep it short, I promise." When the call ended, Isabel let out a resigned breath, saving her half-finished notes. The CFO's request could wait a few hours. Getting the physical demonstration right was crucial. Koenig's team had explicitly asked to see the SUV's interior tech, and any hiccup now would be catastrophic. She hurriedly changed into comfortable jeans, threw on a neat jacket, and headed out. The weekend bustle thickened the sidewalks, but Isabel navigated the crowds with single-minded focus. 15 minutes later, she caught a cab and arrived at the Lionheart building, its towering glass facade a silent sentinel. Inside, the lobby was mostly empty, only a security guard and a few employees who, like her, had come in for extra work. She rode the elevator down to the lower-level engineering bay, an area she rarely visited, though she'd been there once or twice to gather data. The doors opened on a spacious workshop lined with tool benches, diagnostic machines, and at the far end, a gleaming new electric SUV. Priya waved her over with a cheery grin, wearing a well-worn lab coat over casual clothes. "So glad you made it. We're doing a quick test run of the battery swap demonstration, and maybe a partial software update for the onboard display." Isabel nodded, stepping up to the vehicle. Its sleek design was even more impressive up close. Curved lines, tinted windows, a modern front grille. "It looks fantastic. Hard to believe it's still a prototype," Priya beamed. Our team's poured months of work into this. Elysian's interest has me all jittery, but in a good way. If they invest, we can finalize mass production. They popped the hood, which housed the newly developed battery arrangement. Priya launched into a step-by-step explanation of how they'd show Koenig's team the battery compartment. A few engineers tinkered with the onboard computer. Isabel carefully took notes. So, they'll watch us remove a panel, highlight the cooling system, then plug in the diagnostic tool, right? Exactly, Priya said. We'll keep it concise, no more than 10 minutes. But if they ask deeper questions, we'll be ready. A half hour sped by as Isabel reviewed the demonstration script. She offered small suggestions, maybe add a quick mention of how the battery's modular design could reduce long-term maintenance costs. Priya nodded, jotting that down. The synergy of engineering and marketing came together neatly, which made Isabel hopeful. If everything else aligned, Tuesday's show and tell would wow Elysian. Midway through adjusting a display screen, Priya's phone chimed. She glanced at it, then turned to Isabel with raised eyebrows. Mr. King is on his way down here. The security system flagged his keycard entering the lower level. Isabel's heart skipped. He's coming here now? On a Saturday? Priya gave a half laugh. He's probably working around the clock, same as us. I guess he wants to see how the demonstration's going. Isabel suppressed a flutter of nervous excitement, focusing on the SUV's onboard menu. Right, let's just be ready to walk him through everything. Sure enough, moments later the elevator doors hissed open. Zachary King stepped out, wearing a tailored suit that looked somewhat out of place in the workshop's industrial environment. Yet it didn't surprise Isabel. She suspected he woke up in suits the way most people woke in pajamas. His eyes swept the bay, landing on them. Priya straightened, offering a cordial nod. Mr. King, we're just finishing a test run. He approached, footsteps echoing on the polished concrete. Good, he said, eyes traveling over the SUV before settling on Isabel with a hint of surprise. Ms. Larson, you're here too? She tucked a stray hair behind her ear. Priya invited me to make sure the demonstration aligns with the marketing narrative. He nodded slowly, as though pleased. That's proactive. Mind if I see how it's looking? Priya motioned eagerly to the SUV. Not at all. We'll show you everything, from battery inspection to software functionality. They proceeded to open the hood, demonstrating the routine they had carefully choreographed. Isabel explained where the marketing team would add commentary about brand collaboration, how Elysian's cutting-edge approach meshed with Lionheart's reliability. Priya added technical details, pointing out the battery's advanced materials. Zachary King observed intently, occasionally asking pointed questions. How quickly can we swap modules in the field? Is the cooling system fully tested for extreme temperatures? Priya responded with calm confidence while Isabel supplemented the broader consumer angle. Despite the casual setting, he kept his tone measured, as if mentally practicing how Elysian might challenge them on Tuesday. When they finished, Mr. King walked a slow circle around the SUV, trailing a hand along its contour. It's impressive, he murmured. If Elysian sees the potential here, we'll have something extraordinary. Isabel exchanged a glance with Priya. They both sensed his guarded pride. Zachary King rarely spoke with such open admiration. Priya grinned. I'll finalize the demonstration steps. We'll do a full mock run again Monday for any last adjustments. Excellent, Mr. King said. Keep me updated. He nodded to the other engineers, then turned his attention to Isabel. Might I borrow you for a moment? She blinked, quickly handing the tablet to Priya. Sure. They strolled a short distance away, near a row of diagnostic equipment. The hum of an air filter and the low clang of metal tools formed a backdrop. He paused, facing her, a thoughtful expression softening his usual sternness. I didn't expect to see you here on a Saturday, he remarked quietly. She shrugged with a small smile. Same could be said for you, Mr. King. A corner of his mouth lifted. Touché. He glanced back at the SUV. I suppose we're all invested in ensuring everything is flawless. Yes. She hesitated, feeling the undercurrent that always seemed to linger between them. The workshop lighting cast a glow on his features, making him appear almost younger. Is there something you wanted to discuss, aside from the demonstration? He studied her for a moment, hands in his suit pockets. I wanted to confirm that you're comfortable with Tuesday's schedule. You'll be presenting multiple times, fielding questions from Koenig's people, and they can be tough. I don't want you caught off guard. She drew a breath. I'm ready. I've got the data memorized, and if they throw me curveballs, I'll adapt. He gave an approving nod. Good. His voice dipped lower, more personal. I admit, a part of me worries I'm placing too much on your shoulders. You've come so far, so fast. Isabel's chest constricted at the warmth in his tone. You've never forced me, Mr. King. I want this. I'm grateful for your trust. Their eyes met, the ambient noise of the workshop seeming to fade. In that moment, it felt like they were connected by more than a shared corporate mission, a mutual recognition that each was challenging the other to reach higher. She wondered if he might say something else, something that crossed that invisible line between professional and personal. But the distant clank of a metal tool broke the tension. Priya called from across the bay. Isabel, can you double-check the final bullet points on the script? Mr. King exhaled, stepping back. I shouldn't keep you, but if you need anything, information, resources, or simply a moment to breathe, tell me. She nodded, voice soft. I will. Thank you. He inclined his head in a half-bow, then strode away, presumably to return upstairs or head out for the day. Isabel stood there, mind whirling. Each encounter seemed to push them closer to an unspoken boundary. Part of her wanted him to cross it, to speak plainly about whatever simmered between them. But another part cautioned that it could disrupt everything. Her job, their tenuous professional harmony, the biggest deal in Lionheart's history. Steeling herself, she returned to Priya and spent another hour refining the presentation script. They tested the overhead lights, practiced hooking up the diagnostic machine with minimal fuss, and confirmed the brief bullet points that would flash on a mounted screen. By the time they were done, Isabel's feet ached and her stomach rumbled with hunger. Yet satisfaction pulsed in her veins. If Tuesday played out like this, Elysian would be impressed indeed. Finally, she and Priya powered down the bay's lights, locked up behind them, and parted ways in the lobby. Outside, dusk had arrived, painting the sky a soft lavender. Isabel took a few steps toward the street, phone in hand, debating whether to order food or just collapse at home and rummage her fridge for leftovers. Her thoughts circled back to Mr. King. She pictured the subtle concern in his face, his careful choice of words. She recalled the tension in that quiet corner, the certainty that something deeper existed beneath their daily tasks. Maybe it was reckless to let her feelings grow. Perhaps Ms. Pierce would call it naive. Yet the spark was undeniable, and each passing day drew them nearer to a pivotal point. Tugging her jacket closer against the cool air, she waved down a taxi. As she slid into the seat, she realized her reflection in the window looked different. Steadier, more self-assured. The old Isabel would have doubted herself, wondered if she could handle next week's onslaught. Now, she felt the thrill of purpose. The taxi sped off, weaving through evening traffic. In the muted glow of street lamps, she let herself imagine Tuesday going flawlessly, signing a memorandum, Elysian's top execs shaking hands with Lionheart's team, all while she stood among them as a driving force behind the triumph. Maybe afterward she and Mr. King would exchange a glance in the chaos of celebration. Two people who had willed this deal into reality, sharing a quiet moment of victory. Or, if fate twisted, the entire plan could collapse. High-level negotiations were notoriously unpredictable, and Koenig's board could impose last-second demands. But Isabel pushed that fear aside. She preferred to hold on to optimism. One way or another, the coming days would define her path at Lionheart, and perhaps define something deeper between herself and Zachary King. She arrived home, paid the cab driver, and stepped onto the curb. The streetlights flickered overhead. Despite the day's fatigue, her heart beat with anticipation. In just a few days, all the work, the late nights, the hush of possibility, they'd either blossom into success or crash into failure. And in either case, she sensed that she and Mr. King were on a trajectory far beyond a normal boss-assistant relationship. Monday would be for final details, Tuesday for the moment of truth. After that, only time would tell if they could turn an impossible tension into something real, or if the demands of an empire would snuff out whatever spark had taken root. By Monday morning, Lionheart Motors felt like a coiled spring, ready to be unleashed. Every department buzzed with tension. Lawyers huddled over contract clauses, the marketing team rehearsed its slide deck yet again, and engineers triple-checked the electric SUV's demo protocols. Isabel, pulse thrumming, oversaw the final puzzle pieces, darting from finance to engineering to legal. Each time Ms. Pierce saw her rushing down a corridor, she'd bark, "Be sure to eat," or "Don't forget to breathe." A gruff show of concern. Late that afternoon, they convened in the biggest conference room one last time. Mr. King presided at the head of the table, the CFO at his side, and every relevant manager arrayed around them. Isabel stood to deliver her final rundown. "Tomorrow at 10 a.m., she began, Elysian's group arrives. We'll greet them in the executive lobby and lead them to the main conference room. After brief introductions, we split for 2 parallel sessions. Koenig and his top executives will see Priya's engineering demo, while the rest join marketing for brand synergy. By lunchtime, we reconvene for your keynote, Mr. King, then a tour of our manufacturing wing in the afternoon." She slid a printed schedule across the table. Wednesday focuses on contract terms, culminating in a formal memorandum if all goes well. Nods all around, though anxiety tinged every face. Ms. Pierce spoke up. "We've tested the video equipment, the demonstration station, everything. No room for technical flukes." "Agreed," the CFO added. "We'll have a small reception area with refreshments. Let's keep it tasteful, not lavish." Zachary King surveyed them, face resolute. "Excellent. Keep your teams calm, on message. This is the moment we've been building toward." His gaze paused briefly on Isabel. "Everyone understand their roles?" A chorus of agreement. Within minutes, the meeting wrapped up. People scrambled off to finalize tasks. Isabel lingered to confirm last-minute details with Ms. Pierce. When she finished, she realized Mr. King remained in the room, organizing notes at the far end of the table. A sudden hush fell between them once others had left. She approached, breath tightening. "Anything else I can handle before tomorrow?" He shook his head, his expression softening just a fraction. "No, you've done more than enough. Try to get some rest tonight." She nodded, yet deep down she knew her mind would race until dawn. "I'll be ready at 9 a.m. to greet the Elysian team." A brief silence. Then he murmured, "Good. And, Ms. Larson, no matter how tomorrow goes, I'm glad you're part of this." Warmth bloomed in her chest. She dipped her head in acknowledgement. "Thank you, Mr. King." He half smiled. "Go on, get going. I'll see you bright and early." She turned to exit, pulse fluttering. Even in the final moments before the biggest day of her professional life, the quiet tension between them lingered, full of all that had been left unsaid. Tuesday dawned cool and bright. Isabel arrived at Lionheart Motors in her best suit, hair carefully pinned back, eyes sharp despite a fitful night's sleep. A few department heads were already there, pacing in the lobby. At 9:50 a.m., Ms. Pierce murmured a terse, "They're almost here," and Isabel's stomach lurched with adrenaline. Sure enough, a sleek black sedan pulled up outside, followed by 2 more. Koenig stepped out first, followed by Delphine and several other Elysian staffers. They entered to polite handshakes and subdued smiles. Zachary King, resplendent in a dark gray suit, greeted them with measured warmth, his voice carrying confidence that set the tone for the day. Koenig wasted no time. "We're eager to see how your electric SUV handles real-world issues," he said. "Rumors and theories are one thing, but genuine performance is another." With a discreet nod from Mr. King, Isabel guided Koenig and the top execs to the engineering bay, while the rest followed marketing to the brand synergy presentation. The CFO accompanied Isabel, wearing an air of quiet authority. In the bright workshop, Priya and her team stood by, ready to demonstrate. The SUV gleamed under focused overhead lights. Isabel felt a pounding in her heart as Koenig circled the vehicle, eyes critical. Priya launched into her carefully rehearsed routine, removing the side panel, showing the battery housing, then hooking up the diagnostic readout for real-time performance stats. Isabel stepped in at key points, explaining how Lionheart's consumer research aligned with Elysian's priorities. "We've surveyed target demographics who value modular battery systems and consistent software updates," she said, tapping a quick infographic on a monitor. "This design addresses those needs directly." Koenig studied the battery display. "Interesting." He looked at Priya. "How easily can an average technician execute a battery swap?" "Under an hour," Priya answered confidently. "Less with more experience." Another Elysian exec chimed in. "And these rumored issues with cooling? Some forums suggest overheating after extended driving." Priya gestured at a small thermal regulator in the unit. "We've integrated an advanced coolant loop. Tests show less than a 1% temperature spike under heavy load." Isabel added, "And from the consumer side, we're prepared to address any concerns head-on. No vague PR statements, but direct outreach with transparent data." Koenig's sharp gaze flicked between them. Slowly, a trace of approval settled into his features. "You've done your homework. This is far more robust than some of the other prototypes we've seen." They spent another half-hour digging into technicalities. The CFO fielded questions about cost feasibility. Priya and Isabel handled the operational aspects. Finally, Koenig straightened, smoothing his suit jacket. "All right, this looks promising. Let's see what your marketing team has prepared." The CFO guided them back upstairs. As they entered the main conference room, Isabel glimpsed a slideshow in progress. Lionheart leads highlighting potential ad campaigns. Delphine turned, nodding at Koenig. "They've shown a strong synergy concept," she told him. "No big red flags so far." They all took seats as the marketing director concluded. Then Zachary King stepped up. The moment felt electric. Hush fell across the room. He spoke of Lionheart's history, its dedication to innovation, and how Elysian's collaboration could redefine the automotive landscape. His tone was calm yet compelling, each word measured. Isabel watched him with a tingle of awe. In those minutes, he took command of the entire space, tugging minds toward a vision of a future with their new electric SUV conquering markets. The day continued in a blur of smaller breakout sessions. Isabel found herself cornered by a couple of Elysian's mid-level reps, peppering her with questions about brand perceptions. She answered each with data-driven clarity, occasionally feeling Mr. King's gaze across the room, silently encouraging her. By late afternoon, exhaustion pressed down on everyone. Koenig suggested a recess before the scheduled dinner, to which King agreed. The visitors retired to a side lounge, sipping water and murmuring among themselves. Isabel retreated to her cubicle, heart hammering from the day's intensity. She'd just started reviewing her notes when Ms. Pierce appeared. "They're pleased," the older woman said quietly, though her eyes sparked relief. She hinted that tomorrow's contract negotiation might move faster than expected. Isabel's spirits soared. "It's incredible." "Yes." Ms. Pierce gave a tight nod, then glanced sideways. And Mr. King wants you in the final sessions tomorrow. He told me personally. You're part of the official negotiation team now." A bolt of both excitement and trepidation shot through her. "I'll do my best." Ms. Pierce almost smiled. "I know you will." Wednesday arrived with that same electric undercurrent. The Elysian crew sat opposite Lionheart's executives in the executive boardroom, thick with the hush of impending deal-making. Outside, the city bustled, oblivious to the drama unfolding many floors above. The CFO kicked things off, summarizing the major points Elysian had agreed to so far. Then Koenig and his associates laid out their final concerns: royalty percentages, supply chain contingencies, exact timetables for mass production. Lawyers traded carefully phrased clauses. Ms. Pierce kept the meeting running like clockwork. Isabel, perched with her laptop, tracked each shift in agreement. At critical moments, Koenig paused. "We'd like Ms. Larson's input on consumer reaction times if we roll out in multiple territories simultaneously." Isabel answered with calm assurance, citing brand surveys and communication strategies. Koenig nodded, seemingly satisfied. More than once, Zachary King gave her a subtle look of approval, his confidence in her radiating across the table. Hours ticked by. Tension ebbed and flowed as they hashed out details, hammered through risk assessments, and jockeyed over disclaimers. Finally, around midday, Koenig tapped his pen on the table, exchanging a glance with Delphine. They spoke in low tones, then turned to Lionheart's side. "We believe we have an agreement in principle," Koenig said, voice echoing in the silent room. "Our board has signaled readiness to proceed with a memorandum of understanding. If you're prepared, we can sign a preliminary version right now." A flutter of excitement passed through the Lionheart team. Zachary King inclined his head. "We're prepared." Within minutes, documents circulated. Lawyers peered over the language, making final tweaks. Then Koenig and King each signed. The CFO and Delphine witnessed, scribbling their signatures on a separate line. Applause broke out, soft at first, then more spirited. The entire room seemed to exhale in collective relief. Isabel's hands trembled as she clapped, feeling an almost surreal sense of triumph. Koenig set down his pen, standing. "Congratulations, Mr. King. We look forward to a prosperous collaboration." Zachary King stood as well, shaking Koenig's hand firmly. "Likewise. Thank you for your trust in us." Amid the elation, Isabel found herself exchanging grins with Ms. Pierce, the CFO, Priya, everyone who'd poured heart and soul into the project. Cameras snapped pictures. Someone popped open a bottle of sparkling cider, though Mr. King had insisted on keeping it low-key. Laughter rippled as glasses clinked in subdued celebration. In the swirl of well-wishers, Isabel caught Mr. King's gaze. He gave a small, private nod, an acknowledgement of her role in bringing them over the finish line. An hour later, the Elysian team left for the airport, their mission accomplished. The Lionheart staff converged in the main lobby for an impromptu wrap-up. The CFO delivered a brief congratulatory speech praising everyone's efforts. Then, gradually, people broke off in clusters, calling family or heading home early for the first time in weeks. Amid the lingering crowd, Ms. Pierce tapped Isabel's arm. "He's waiting in his office," she said quietly, arching an eyebrow. "Go on." Isabel blinked, warmth flooding her cheeks. "Right," she said, not quite meeting Ms. Pierce's knowing gaze. She took the elevator up, heart fluttering. The corridor was eerily quiet. Most had left to celebrate or finally rest. At the far end, she saw Mr. King's door ajar. She knocked softly and heard his voice. "Come in." Stepping inside, she found him at his desk, the skyline beyond tinted gold by late afternoon sun. He set aside a stack of freshly signed documents, rising to greet her. "Close the door, please." She did, the faint click echoing in the hush. A pulse of anticipation beat at her temples as she approached the desk. He leaned against the edge, arms crossed, expression unguarded for once. "I wanted to thank you," he began. "Without your diligence, your data, this might not have happened." Her breath caught. "You're giving me too much credit. It was a team effort." "But your part was crucial," he insisted, voice low. "I saw how Koenig relied on your insights, and you carried the negotiations on the consumer side with real poise." Her cheeks warmed. I only had that poise because you believed in me." A quiet nod. His gaze bore into her, and the charged silence returned, more intense than ever. At last, he spoke with a tentative softness. "Now that we're past the crisis of closing this deal, we can step back and consider what comes next." She swallowed. "Yes, I suppose so." His eyes flickered. "I'd like you to stay on at Lionheart permanently, not just as a temp or an assistant, but part of the specialized team, your own projects, real responsibility. You've more than earned it." Her heart soared. Despite the swirl of personal feelings, the thought of forging an official place in this company was everything she'd dreamed of. "That means a lot," she whispered. "Thank you." A trace of a smile. "I'll have HR handle the paperwork if you accept." She laughed, relieved. "I accept." He nodded, looking almost bashful, the unstoppable, steely CEO, undone by a moment of sincerity. He took a step forward, voice dropping. "There's another matter, too, something I've tried to keep separate from the job. But now—" Her stomach flipped. She sensed what he meant, felt it in the air. "Yes?" she managed softly. He hesitated, collecting himself. "These last weeks, I've admired not only your skills but also your resilience, your—" He paused, searching for words. "Your presence. And I realize how complicated it is given my position, but I can't pretend there's not a connection here." Her pulse pounded in her ears. She parted her lips, trying to speak, but emotion held her. They stood less than an arm's length apart, the hush of the office pressing in. She remembered Ms. Pierce's warning about lines, but her heart hammered with certainty. "I feel it too," she confessed, voice trembling. Relief eased his posture. Slowly, as though giving her a chance to pull away, he reached for her hand. "If we explore this, we need to do it carefully, professionally, and only if you're comfortable." The warmth of his fingers against hers made her head spin. I am," she breathed. "But it's new territory for me." A faint, almost shy smile tugged at his lips. "It's new territory for me as well." They stood there, letting the moment stretch. Through the window, the sun dipped toward the horizon, casting the room in amber. A sense of rightness filled Isabel, despite the risk. The person standing before her wasn't just a powerful CEO. He was a man who'd guided her growth, respected her ideas, and found a spark with her amid the high-stakes swirl of corporate life. She took a half-step closer, heart in her throat. His gaze flicked to her mouth, an unspoken question. She gave the subtlest nod, and then his hand gently lifted to cradle her cheek, drawing her forward into a soft, hesitant kiss. It lasted only seconds, but it felt like stepping off a cliff and discovering she could fly. When they pulled back, their breaths mingled. 100 emotions crashed over her. Triumph at the new job, relief at Elysian's signature, and this swirling, tender hope that maybe their bond could blossom into something deeper. He swallowed, voice husky. "We'll take it slow. Figure out the details. But for now, let's just savor this victory." She nodded, eyes shining. "Agreed." Outside, the skyline glowed in fading sunlight. Inside, they lingered in that quiet, stolen moment, two people who had conquered impossible odds and found in each other a bond neither had expected. Tomorrow they'd navigate new challenges, new boundaries. But for this single, precious evening, they had every reason to believe that the door to their future, both personal and professional, had just opened wide. If you enjoyed this story, Don't miss the next one. Just click on the screen.